John Wayne Gacy, aka the Killer Clown, is one of the most notorious serial killers of recent history. For many of his murders, he would dress up as a character that he called Pogo the Clown, and he would trick young boys into these fake magic tricks that would end up being fatal for them. And Pogo the Clown would take these young men's lives in the most heinous of ways. Hello everyone! It's been a while since I've posted on this channel, and I'm not going to talk about it too much in this video right here, right now, because I just want this video to be about this case. I'll leave my second YouTube channel linked down below in the description. I might make a video on where I've been for the last 2 months. I don't know, that's not a promise, but if I do talk about it, it'll be on that channel if you do want to keep updated. But what I will say here in this video is thank you so much for being patient and waiting for my return, and thank you for coming back. Thanks for coming back to see me. I'm so excited to be back. Things are back to normal. As of this video, you can expect regular uploads again. I'm so excited. I'm so excited for this video specifically. I'm so excited to speak to you all in the comments. Me and my team have worked so hard on this one. So with all that being said, let's just get straight into the case. Today, we're going to be talking about John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown. But before we get into the case, I do just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. There are a lot of content warnings for this case, so I'm just going to list them all off. Please listen carefully, and if there's anything that you don't want to hear about right now, feel free to click off this video. I will be back very soon with another video, I promise. So the list of content warnings is as follows. Mental health conditions, including antisocial personality disorder, multiple personality disorder, and paranoid schizophrenia, suicidal thoughts, brief mentions of vomiting, alcohol and drug abuse, domestic abuse, child abuse, homophobia, necrophilia, molestation, sexual assault, rape, and sex crimes against children. I know, it's a very big list. Like I said, if you need to click out for your own well-being, that's absolutely fine. Hopefully I'll see you again at some other point. All that being said, let's get straight into the case. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He was the second of 3 children to John Gacy Sr. and Marion Robinson. Marion was a stay-at-home mother, and so John Wayne Gacy was mainly parented by his mother throughout his childhood because his father was just always off working. But that was probably for the best because Gacy's father was a horrible man. He was a very severe alcoholic after serving in World War I. He was left with a lot of trauma after the World War, and so he turned to alcohol after that, and alcohol made him not a very nice man at all. He was cold, he was mean, he was verbally and physically abusive to all members of his family, his wife and all of his kids, but actually the main focus of his abuse was his second child, John Wayne Gacy. I think the main reason for this is because he was the only man in the house. He wasn't a man, he was a child, but he would always defend his mother and his sisters from his father's abuse, and so his father saw John Wayne Gacy as kind of his only opposition because the girls never put up a fight. One of Gacy's earliest memories of his father was a mechanic, and so this one time they were out in the garage, his father was showing him this engine that he was working on or something, and Gacy, being a child, being very curious, he started like messing about with some of the parts, and his father hit the roof. He was furious. He grabbed a leather belt and started beating Gacy with it, and then at one point his mother jumped in to try and save her son, but then his father only ended up abusing her as well. And this was quite a common occurrence. Gacy's father would just lash out at anyone that tried to go against him. Anyone that ever stood up to him would feel his wrath. Which is actually why a lot of the time John Wayne Gacy would just sit and let the abuse happen because, well, to be honest, he knew that if he didn't let it happen to him, if he wasn't on the receiving end, then his mother or his sisters would. So effectively, Gacy was a voluntary punch bag for his father to save his mother and his sisters. All the way through his childhood, he did that. And even aside from these traumatic beatings, Gacy's father would make his son's life hell in different ways as well. He would be verbally abusive, manipulative. He would make his life a misery day in, day out. He would let his son know that he was disappointed in him. He would always call him dumb, stupid, a failure. He would also be very homophobic towards his son, despite Gacy never explicitly talking about his sexuality with his father. But he would still tell his son that he would probably grow up queer. And he would always call him like awful names relating to that. He was convinced that his son was gay and he had a huge problem with it. And things only worsened for Gacy when he was 7 years old. That's how young he had been this whole time. His father hated this 7-year-old boy. But yeah, things only got worse for him when he was about 7 years old and his father introduced him to one of his friends. And this friend, this grown man, proceeded to sexually abuse John Wayne Gacy for the next few months. And Gacy never said a word to anyone about this abuse as it was happening because he just knew that he would somehow be punished for it. He knew what his father was like. He knew that his father wouldn't take his side. And so he was scared into silence. He never told anyone about it until he was an adult. But later that year, so Gacy was still only about 7 or 8 years old at this point, he actually went on to sexually abuse someone himself. He and one of his friends actually cornered this girl at school and molested her. His father ended up finding out about this, and as I'm sure you can imagine, he was furious. So once again, he grabbed that leather belt and beat Gacy black and blue with it for like the 100th time. But by now, he'd kind of stopped reacting to it. Gacy would just sit there and let the beatings happen. He didn't scream or cry or make a fuss anymore. And this kind of took the fun out of it for his father, which is such an awful thing to think about, that his father was getting a kick out of abusing his son and seeing the fear in his own son's eyes. He just wasn't getting the same thrill anymore. And so Gacy's father upped the ante. He started beating him harder and with new weapons until one day when Gacy was only about 11 years old and his father knocked him out clean, unconscious. And this incident actually left Gacy with long-lasting health issues. I think it must have damaged his brain in some sort of way, because after this, he started having fainting spells. He would just be going about his day and he would just faint, just knocked out on the floor. He would have these blackouts so frequently, and he actually had to be hospitalized for them a few times. But that was only one of many physical ailments that John Wayne Gacy had throughout his life. He was quite an ill person. He always had something wrong with him. He had a burst appendix at one point. He had quite a serious heart condition that he was in and out of hospital for most of his childhood. And his dad, being the awful man that he was, he never believed his son with any of these like physical illnesses. Burst appendix, he thought he was lying. He thought his son was lying about it. These fainting spells that he would have all the time, he thought that they were just fake and for attention or for sympathy. But despite all his ailments and his horrific home life, John Wayne Gacy was able to lead a semi-normal life, like a childhood, adolescence, and when he turned 18 years old, he decided that he was going to get a career in politics. And I think the main reason he chose politics was for his dad's sake. He wanted to impress his father. He wanted a well-respected job so that he could finally earn his father's respect. But it actually ended up going the opposite way. Gacy specifically wanted to work with the Democratic Party, which was not the party that his father supported. And this only gave him more fuel to ridicule his son for. But at this point in his life, Gacy is pretty much all grown up. He's like 18, 19 years old. He is a fully grown man, and he is quite a big guy. Not necessarily height-wise, but he was quite overweight. He had just generally quite a lot of body mass. Due to his heart condition, he couldn't exercise very well, and so for pretty much all of his life, Gacy was quite overweight. And he was bigger than his father. He had strength and body mass on his side, something that his father was a little bit scared of now. And so by now, his dad had kind of stopped physically abusing him. I think he was scared that one day Gacy was just going to turn around and fight back and knock his dad out. So now instead of the physical abuse, Gacy's father was thinking of new different, more creative ways to make his son's life hell. So he bought him a car, right? Which sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? Dad buying the son a car, that's usually a good thing. No, he bought this car for Gacy with the intention of holding it against him because he knew that his son couldn't afford a car himself, but he kind of needed one to be able to get to and from work. So his dad bought him this car and he said, right, you can have it now and you can pay me back monthly for the next few years until you pay off the car. But if Gacy was ever short or late on these monthly payments, his dad would withhold the use of the car. He would take the keys off his son so that he couldn't get to and from work, which meant that Gacy couldn't get to work anymore in this car, which then had serious implications on his life. He was either late or he would miss days at work. He would get into trouble with his boss. He risked losing his job because his dad kept taking the car away from him. After about a year of this, having the car taken away from him time and time again, Gacy was sick of it, and so he went out and bought a spare set of keys for the car so that next time his dad tried to take them off him, he could still just get in the car and drive away. And his father was fuming about this. And he wasn't going to let his son get away with this. And so his father went to the car and took one of the parts out. I don't know which part, but it was a part that you need to be able to drive it, because when Gacy went and got back in the car, it wouldn't go. It wouldn't set off. And this was John Wayne Gacy's breaking point. He was now about 20 years old, and his life, his home life, had just been constant stress and animosity and abuse and torture all his life, and he was sick of it now. So one day, Gacy woke up and decided that he was just going to run away. He was going to run far away from home, and he went all the way to Las Vegas, Nevada. And here, he was finally free. He got himself a job as an ambulance driver, which proved a little bit too stressful for him. He didn't really like it. And so he asked to be transferred to the morgue instead. So now, this future serial killer is working with dead bodies. But Gacy's employers were not aware at the time that Gacy was actually homeless. When he ran away to Las Vegas, he hadn't found anywhere to stay. He was just sleeping on the street. And now that he'd been transferred to the mortuary, he decided that he was going to try and live there. Live amongst the dead bodies in the morgue. So he bought himself a second-hand cot bed and set it up behind the embalming room. And he lived there for months without anyone knowing. But that aside, weirdly enough, everything was going quite well for John Wayne Gacy at this point because, well, for the first time in his life, he was away from his abusive father. He was making friends. He was getting to know people. He was free. He had his own life. Things were great. But then he did something that ruined all of that. One night, he was about to go to sleep, as usual, behind the embalming room in his second-hand cot bed, when he decided to go over to one of the fridges, where they keep the dead bodies, because he remembered that there was the body of a teenage boy in one of them. So he pulled the table out and climbed up on top of it, alongside this teenage boy's corpse, and just started cuddling him. He was there for a couple of minutes, just holding this boy's dead body until he started freaking out all of a sudden. It was at first he was enjoying it, and then I think he realized what he was doing and panic started to set in. It honestly sounds like he had a panic attack. He jumped off this table, put the body back, and went to bed and tried to just forget what he'd just done. But the next morning, when Gacy woke up, he was still super anxious about what he'd done the night before. He called his mother up in an absolute state of panic, begging her to let him come home. So the very next day, John Wayne Gacy was back in Chicago living with his parents. He was back to square one, and he decided that after this incident, he was going to change his life. He enrolled in a business university and he really got to work. He did really well, and by the age of 21, he graduated with his diploma. From there, he got a job in a shoe shop as a salesman, and he was really good at this job because Gacy was quite good at persuading people, and so he just kept getting promoted. And for one of these promotions, he was actually transferred to a different store in Springfield, Illinois, and it was there that he met a beautiful young woman named Marilyn Myers that he started courting. So let's just pause here for a sec and look at John Wayne Gacy's life. He's really seemed to have turned things around. He's gone to university, got his diploma, got a really good job that he just keeps getting promoted in. He's got this girl that he likes. He's living a normal life now. He also got involved with a lot of community stuff as well. He joined an organisation called the Jaycees, which do a lot of like voluntary community work. It was a very respected thing because it was all voluntary. Like they didn't get paid for it. They were just doing it for the good of the community. And Gacy managed to work his way to the top of that too. He was very well respected in the Jaycees, and so he just kept earning higher and higher titles. And he managed to work his way all the way up to vice president. Everyone loved him there. He was doing really, really well until he did something to ruin it again. So right now, he's still dating Marilyn Myers that he met at work. But one night, after one of his Jaycee meetings, he actually cheated on her with one of the Jaycees. And this was kind of a long time coming. Gacy had always wanted to explore his sexuality, his potential bisexuality. He'd always known that he was attracted to men, but he'd been too scared to try anything, initiate anything, until this one particular night when he was very, very drunk and he made a move on one of his Jaycee friends and they reciprocated. In fact, I actually think it was the other way around. I think it was the other man that offered to Gacy and he accepted. I think that's the only way that this happened, was that he didn't initiate it. And I don't know if Marilyn actually ever found out about this. I don't know if she knew that Gacy cheated on her at all. But this really threw Gacy's head through the ringer a bit. He was so confused now because he'd only ever been with women all his life and he liked Marilyn. He did. He had feelings for her, but he was really excited about this guy and the potential to get with other guys as well. He realized that that was what he wanted, to be getting with men, not to be with Marilyn. He felt like he was kind of stuck with her now. But he didn't want to leave Marilyn. Not necessarily because he was in love with her, more so because she came from a very rich family. A very, very rich family. Her dad was minted. Her dad actually ended up buying 3 KFC restaurant franchises that he was going to hand down to his daughter one day. His daughter and whoever his daughter ended up marrying. And so Gacy was like, that's gonna have to be me. There was a lot of money in owning 3 restaurants, and so John Wayne Gacy decided to propose to Marilyn Myers, and within 6 months they were married and living in Iowa. I think that's where the 3 KFC restaurants were based. I think that's where Marilyn was originally from. So they moved to Iowa, and her father handed down the 3 KFC restaurants to his daughter and her new husband. So now John Wayne Gacy was made manager of all 3 of these KFC restaurants, which meant he was raking in a lot of money. He was making, in a year, the equivalent of like $135,000 a year today, which you would think would be making him really happy. He'd be really excited. But no, he just could not get that sexual experience with that man out of his head. He knew that he was living a lie here with Marilyn, this life with all the restaurants. It's not what he wanted. He wanted to be exploring his sexuality. And this is where things start to get weird. So at one of these particular KFC restaurants, there was a basement that Gacy nicknamed the Club. And every now and again, he would have employees down in the basement for drinks after work. But when I say employees, he would actually only invite a very small percentage of the workforce, and that small percentage just so happened to be teenage boys or young men, early 20s. He didn't care to have the women over for drinks or like the older people. It was just the young men and the boys. Gacy would provide these young boys and men with alcohol underage, and they'd never really experienced this before. They'd never really tried alcohol before, and so they would get really, really drunk because they didn't know their limits. And after a few months of drinking in the club, Gacy started making sexual advances on these boys once he'd got them drunk. Sometimes the boys would go along with it and it would be reciprocated, but other times the boys would be like, whoa, what are you doing? I don't want to do that. And then Gacy always had an answer. He would play it off as if it had been a test. He'd be like, good, I was testing you. I wanted to judge your morals. You passed the test. And then he would just like laugh it off. Despite regularly cheating on his wife with his employees, John Wayne Gacy and Marlon went on to have 2 children together, a son and a daughter named Michael and Christine. And Gacy always looked back on this time in his life very, very fondly. He said that these were the best years of his life when he was managing these restaurants, he had a wife at home, he had 2 beautiful children, and even his relationship with his father was going well. His dad had a whole change of heart towards Gacy. Ever since he became successful, managing 3 restaurants, he had a wife, he had 2 kids, he married into money. His dad liked him now. He respected him now. It was a very conditional love, and love is a very big word to use. But Gacy was absolutely over the moon that he had finally earned this love and respect from his father, something that he had never been able to do, no matter how hard he tried all his life. His dad actually apologized to Gacy for the way that he treated him all his life, and his exact words were, "I was wrong about you." And this just meant the world to Gacy. He had yearned for this all his life, and he finally had it. So yeah, things were going amazingly well for Gacy at this point in his life. Nothing was actually going wrong at all for once. He was still working with the Jaycees. He'd like transferred to the Iowa Jaycees now that he'd moved there, and they loved him because he was the manager of 3 KFC restaurants. He would always provide free KFC at their meetings. He'd give them all free chicken, free alcohol. They would meet up in the basement club. He actually insisted that they all call him the Colonel, which is a bit weird. But yeah, things were going a bit too well for a bit too long, and as always with John Wayne Gacy, he has to do something to fuck it up. So one thing about the Iowa Jaycees, they threw wild parties, like wild parties. There were drugs, drink, porn, sex workers, prostitutes, literally anything, everything. These parties were freaking crazy, apparently. You name it, they were doing it. And more often than not, they were hosted in Gacy's basement club. So after a few of these crazy parties, and after gaining all of the Jaycees' trust, Gacy then made a really weird suggestion. He told all the men that they should bring along their young sons to the next party. They're like 14, 15, 16-year-old sons. And for some reason they all agreed. They all thought that would be a good idea. But you can see where this is going, right? You can see Gacy's intentions here. He is attracted to young boys and young men. That's obviously the reason that he wanted them to bring along their sons. Gacy wanted to take advantage of these children sexually, and he had a plan on how he was going to do it. In fact, he'd concocted this whole like fake story that he would tell these kids in order to gain their trust and be able to abuse them. So he would tell these young boys that he was conducting scientific research into homosexuality, and he was, doing real tests on real people, and he needed participants. He needed young boys to take part in sex acts for scientific research purposes, and he would pay the boys for this. He would pay them like $500 to have sex with him, basically. And for these young teenage boys, $500 is a blooming lot of money. A lot of money that a lot of them didn't want to refuse. And so this tactic worked. More often than not, these boys would take the money to have sex with John Wayne Gacy. But Gacy didn't start using this tactic straight away. This was a tactic that he had built over time. So let's talk about his first ever victim. This first victim was a 15-year-old boy named Donald Voorhees. He was one of the Jaycees' young sons. And actually, this first victim, Gacy didn't lure back to the KFC basement. He lured him back to his home, where he lived with his wife and 2 kids. Gacy took Donald home, got him really drunk, and showed him porn for the first time ever in his life. So they were watching straight porn on the TV, and Gacy turned to Donald and he said, in order to have sex with a woman, you need to have had sex with a man first. You know that, right? You know that rule? And Donald was like, what? No, I never knew about that. I never knew about this rule. Obviously not, because it's not real. But of course, Donald, being 15 years old and drunk, he believed this older man. Because why wouldn't he? He had no reason not to trust his father's friend. And so Donald Voorhees agreed to have sex with John Wayne Gacy that night. And this actually happened a few more times over the next few months, I believe. And eventually, after 6 months of suffering in silence, Donald Voorhees told his father what John Wayne Gacy had been doing to him. And understandably so, his father was seething. He immediately reported Gacy to the police. Police went round to his address and arrested him on suspicion of sexual offences against a minor. But Gacy was incredibly defensive. He maintained his innocence, so much so that he actually demanded they give him a lie detector test because he was so sure that he would pass it. Which, remember, this was like the 1960s, and polygraph tests were really believed back then. They were quite a new thing, and so everyone was really excited about them. Everyone believed them. These days, not so much. No one believes polygraph tests. But back then, this would have been seen as a big, bold move from John Wayne Gacy because, like I said, everyone believed them. So police gave him the polygraph test, and he didn't exactly fail, but he also didn't pass. It was inconclusive. They couldn't get a result. This essentially told police that Gacy was nervous. He was too anxious for them to even be able to get a reading on him. So they questioned him again, and they said, well, why would Donald's father lie about this? What does he have to gain from this? And Gacy said that he thought that Donald's father was after his position as vice president of the Jaycees. He was jealous. He wanted to take him down as the competition. And so starting these rumours, these allegations, very serious allegations, could get Gacy taken out of the Jaycees so then Donald's father could take his spot. And this conspiracy theory was actually backed up by a lot of the other Jaycees. They all started defending John Wayne Gacy and denouncing Donald's father. The Jaycees didn't believe that Gacy could be capable of such heinous things. They thought he was a great guy because all they'd ever seen was a great guy. They all agreed that Donald's father must just be jealous and he must have just been trying to take him down, and so they all fell out with him and backed John Wayne Gacy. So it seemed that all in all, Gacy was going to be fine after this. He had pretty much everyone on his side. No one believed the allegations. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted revenge, specifically on 15-year-old Donald Voorhees for telling. Gacy was eventually released from police custody when they decided that he was innocent, and so he went back to work at the KFC restaurant, and he pulled aside one of his young employees, a 16-year-old boy named Russell Schroeder. Russell was quite a muscular boy, and so Gacy gave him this proposition. He offered him $2,500, a lot of money for a 16-year-old. He would pay Russell that if he would track down Donald Voorhees, beat him up, and tell him to retract his statement. And Russell was up for it. He could not turn down that kind of money. So the next day, Russell lured Donald Voorhees into a secluded area in the park, sprayed him in the eyes with pepper spray, and demanded that he retract the accusations against Gacy. But Donald said no. He wasn't going to do that. So Russell knew what he had to do, and he beat up Donald Voorhees. He left him laying on the floor in such a state. He had blood all over him. He couldn't get up for a while. But little did Russell know, Donald Voorhees knew who he was, and he'd seen him before he pepper sprayed him in the eyes. And so eventually when Donald could get up and go to the police station to report this, he gave over Russell's name because he knew who had attacked him. The very next day, Russell was arrested. He was taken for questioning and he denied everything. He was like, nah, I've never seen Donald Voorhees in my life. I never did that. But as the questionings continued, he knew that he couldn't get away with it. And so eventually he told the truth, that John Wayne Gacy had paid him to do that. So now things look a million times worse for Gacy, because now not only is he charged with the sexual offences, but he looks guilty as hell because he's trying to get people to retract his statement by beating them as well. So yeah, he's still charged with the sexual offences, and now he's also charged with trying to intimidate a witness, and yeah, he just looks a million times more guilty. Before he was due to go to trial for this, John Wayne Gacy was given like psychiatric evaluations and observations and stuff, He actually spent a whole 17 days just being watched by a load of doctors so that they could observe his behaviour. At the end of all of these tests, John Wayne Gacy was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. However, his doctors said that they really didn't think medication would help at all. They thought that nothing could be done to help or change this man. No treatment, no medication under the sun could fix John Wayne Gacy. But he was deemed fit to stand trial, where he actually pled guilty to sexually assaulting Donald Voorhees. But in the exact same breath, so he's just pled guilty, but then he went on to say, oh, but it was consensual. And actually, Donald asked me to do it. So why would you plead guilty if you insist that it was consensual? Something's not quite adding up there. Gacy said that Donald was the one that initiated the sexual contact that they had that night, but then in the aftermath, Donald regretted it, changed his mind, and that is where these allegations came from. But despite all of his excuses, all of his lies, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for this. The very same day that Gacy got that verdict, his wife Marlin filed for divorce, and she actually won custody of both of their children as well, and from that day on, he never saw any of them ever again. So Gacy goes to prison, and just like many other times in his life, he has hit a new low. This seems to happen quite a lot for Gacy. He hits rock bottom, gets in prison, or has these allegations, something happens, something disastrous happens, but he always manages to build his life back up again. Well, I suppose as much as you can build your life back up in prison. As far as prison lives go, he had a blooming good one. He was a model prisoner. All the staff, all the guards loved him because he was just very well behaved. And this meant that he got a lot of perks very early on in his prison stay. He was made head cook, within a few months. There was also a JC's organisation within the prison. Fancy that. So, surprise, surprise, he joined, worked his way up the ranks, and very quickly became one of the most powerful people within the JC's, the prison JC's. And he was a very, very popular man in that prison. Everyone loved John Wayne Gacy for some reason. And when he initially joined the JC's, they only had 50 members. But because all the other inmates loved Gacy so much, he managed to get them all to join the JC's. It went from 50 when he joined to 650. He made 600 other inmates want to join his club. And Gacy managed to do a lot as part of the prison JC's. He made the most changes in that prison that anyone ever had. He campaigned for better living conditions, increased pay for inmates, and he got everything he ever asked for, including a mini golf course in the prison yard. So of course, everyone loved him. After only about a year into this 10-year sentence, Gacy applied for parole, which was rejected because he had served 1/10 of his sentence, and it didn't seem like he was that much of a changed man. So this only motivated him to try even harder and then reapply for parole, and hopefully, if they could see how many improvements he'd made, they might let him out. So he did everything he could to try and impress the parole board. He took 16 high school courses, so now he had 16 more qualifications. He could prove to them that he would be a very valuable member of society if they let him out, because 16 more qualifications. But in the middle of all of this hard work, Gacy got some awful news. His father had passed away, and he was so incredibly heartbroken over this. I think because it had taken him so long to earn his father's love and respect, and now he'd only had it for such a short amount of time, and it was just ripped away from him just as quick as he'd got it. And he really, really struggled with his grief. He tried to apply for leave to be able to go to his father's funeral, but that was actually denied. And this only made the grieving process even harder, that he couldn't say goodbye to his father, that he couldn't, see his family and speak to them. But yeah, life goes on. Gacy just kept working on those high school qualifications so that he could eventually apply for parole again in a year's time. Actually, it was less than a year. I think it was about another 6 months after his last application. So he'd only done a year and a half of his 10-year sentence before he applied again. And this time, it was granted. John Wayne Gacy was allowed to leave prison after serving 1.5 years for raping a child. So he was released from prison and he was put on probation for 1 year. And one of the rules of his probation was that his parole officers, is it parole? Probation? I don't know. Basically, they needed to know where he lived at all times. Of course, they needed to be able to keep tabs on him. One little problem though, John Wayne Gacy's wife left him, and so he didn't have a house to go back to. So the only option he had was to move back home and live with his mother in his old family home, now without his father in it. And Gacy felt as though this was such a setback. He was like back to square one in his life. And another one of the rules of his probation, his parole, I don't know, what's the right word to use? I don't know. Another one of the rules was that he had a 10 p.m. curfew, which made him feel like a child again. Like, he was living at home with his mother, with a curfew. He had a bedtime. He couldn't go out with his friends. I don't think he had many friends. He had to be home by 10 p.m. And this was like hell for Gacy. But I mean, it was better than prison. Anything was better than prison. And so he got on with it. He started rebuilding his life again from the ground up. Of course, managing 3 KFC stores was a thing of the past. Ever since the divorce, of course, his wife managed to keep the KFC restaurants. And so John Wayne Gacy went out and got himself a job as a chef because he did have a lot of culinary experience working in the KFCs and then, of course, being head chef or head cook in the prison. But even though he was out of prison now, John Wayne Gacy became very, very depressed in his new life. He had gone from having it all a few years ago. He had the wife, the kids, the house, the 3 restaurants, the JCs, the power, the respect, the money, everything. He had a great life and he'd lost it all now. He very quickly grew bored with this new life, and with very little to do, John Wayne Gacy would soon be back to his criminal ways. 9 months into his probation, in 1971, John Wayne Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting another teenage boy. At this point, John was about 29, 30 years old. The teenage boy wasn't named in any of the articles that we could find, although it did seem as though he was a runaway. In fact, very reminiscent of my last serial killer case, the Vampire of Hanover. He would specifically go to the train station to target runaways who were desperate for things like shelter, warmth, food, things that a runaway is not going to say no to. And it's believed that in this instance, that's exactly what John Wayne Gacy offered this young boy. So yeah, they believe that Gacy picked up this teenage runaway from the train station or the bus station or whatever and took him back to his home. When they got there, Gacy tried to rape this boy, but he actually escaped and managed to run away and tell the police. And this sexual assault case actually made it all the way up to the trial process. So they were due to go to court for this, but on the day that it went to trial, the victim didn't show up at the courthouse. And so the case was actually dropped completely, which is very, very frustrating. And you can kind of see it from both sides. How are they supposed to have a trial if the victim, the only witness that they've got, isn't there? But also at the same time, this is a man that has literally been found guilty of that same crime before, and he's still on probation for it. So it's believable that he probably did this. But anyway, he was let free with absolutely zero repercussions. Like, not even extended probation or anything like that. It was literally as if it was just forgotten about. It was as if the accusations just never even happened. And we don't really know much more about that case at all, although a lot of people believe that Gacy did a similar thing to this boy as he did to Donald Voorhees. You know, he paid Russell to go and beat him up and retract the statement. Maybe that's why this victim never turned up to the courthouse. Maybe he'd been threatened by John Wayne Gacy or by, you know, a minion of his. Which makes the trial outcome even more frustrating because Gacy has also been found guilty of trying to intimidate a witness before. So if that's a theory in this case, I don't know, his track record is kind of proving itself here. He looks like he's just repeating the same things, but for some reason they can't prove it this time round, which is very, very frustrating. But anyway, this close call that happened right here was enough to scare John Wayne Gacy into laying low for a few months, at least until his probation was up. He was on probation for like a full year, so for the rest of it, he was just going to stay quiet, not commit any more crimes. But once that day came that he was released from probation, what's it called? His probation ended, Gacy was right back to it. Actually, that was factually incorrect. He gave it 4 days. 4 days. His probation ended. 4 days later, he was right back to it. John Wayne Gacy sexually assaulted another young boy. And again, this boy isn't named in any articles, although this incident went a little bit different to the last one. This time, Gacy actually pretended to be a cop. He walked up to this young boy, flashed a fake police badge, or like one that he'd stolen, no idea where he got it from, flashed this police badge and told the kid to get in his car with him. And of course the kid did it because he thinks he's a police officer. He's not going to say no to a police officer. So Gacy drove this boy back to his house, forced him to engage in sexual acts with him, and when he was done, he just turned to the boy and he was like, you can go now, just let him free. But then there was quite the turn of events. Allegedly, so we don't know if this is exactly how this went, but allegedly, this young boy that had just been raped by Gacy turned to him and he told Gacy that he was going to go to the police about it, but Gacy could stop him going to the police if he gave him some money. So he blackmailed Gacy, but Gacy refused to give over a single penny. He wasn't going to pay this boy. And so, as promised, the boy went to the police station, told them everything, and John Wayne Gacy was invited in for an interview. But in this interview, Gacy told the police about the blackmailing. So he didn't tell them the whole story. Of course he couldn't, otherwise he would have to tell police that he did rape the boy. But he told police that the boy was blackmailing him, but he twisted the story. He basically said that the kid wanted money out of Gacy and the kid was willing to ruin Gacy's life over it if he didn't give him any money. And so that's where these false accusations came from. At least that's what Gacy said to the police. So now the kid wasn't seen as a credible source. They couldn't believe the story that he told them about the sexual assault. And so, again, the case was just dropped. Gacy has done this twice, sexually assaulted 2 teenage boys, and somehow both of the cases have been dropped. And because both of these accusations were dropped, the Iowa Parole Board didn't hear about either of the cases, either of the accusations. They had no idea that Gacy was still offending, still being accused of the same crimes while he was on probation. They thought that he was doing really well and that he was getting back to a normal life after prison. And because he seemed to be a changed man in the eyes of the parole board, who didn't actually know anything, in a month's time, once his probation was over, they were like, cool, seems like John Wayne Gacy's a normal guy now. He can just go out into the world. So not only has his probation ended and he's got off scot-free, but also at the end of his probation, they decided to wipe his criminal record completely. For some reason. I don't know why they would do that. So now there was no record of him ever being a sexual predator. He would be allowed to apply for any job that he wanted. His past cannot hold him back at all. There is no record of it. There's only record, for the police on their systems and whatever. But he doesn't have to disclose the fact that he is a predator to anyone now. But that didn't stop the rumors and stuff in that area. Everyone knew that there was something weird about Gacy and they'd seen police outside his house, and even his own mother at this point in time was sick of all the trouble that Gacy was causing. Police were always at the house, he was always doing court trials, and she was always being called into the station because she needed to be interviewed as his mother, and it got to the point where she actually offered her son money to move out of the house and leave her alone. And gladly he accepted, because he didn't want to live with his mum anymore, but money was his issue. He couldn't afford to move out. So he accepted that money and used it to put down a deposit on a brand new house for himself. It was a ranch-style house in a small town called Cook County in Illinois. And this was like a brand new start for John Wayne Gacy. And you know what he's like, whenever he has a brand new start, he always reaches rock bottom and then has a brand new start and somehow manages to build himself an even better reputation than the one that he had before. And that's exactly what he did. He starts making friends with all his new neighbours, he's mooching, he's socialising, he is offering out free favours left, right and centre, he's like mowing people's lawns, shoveling snow for them off their driveways, doing things for free, making everyone love him. And every year he would host huge parties at his house on his land, because he had a lot of land, and he would invite like hundreds of people. Everyone who was anyone was at John Wayne Gacy's parties, even like politicians, like very respected people in those areas. People looked forward to these parties, they loved them, they loved John. And after a little while of having his life back together, Gacy actually ended up moving his mother back in with him, because she was getting older, and after her husband died, she was all alone. So yeah, now that he'd calmed down and seemingly stopped committing crimes for a little while, he moved her back in. And it was actually around this time that Gacy met the next love of his life, a woman named Carol Hoff. Actually, I say met, but the two of them had actually known each other for a very, very long time. In fact, they dated briefly in high school, but things didn't really work out and they just went separate ways. So now, when Gacy was like 31, they reconnected and rekindled their romance. They'd both, since high school, gone on and had their own lives. They'd married, had kids. Both of them had ended up divorcing, and now they were both single in time to meet each other in their 30s. And they really got on. They got on like a house on fire. The two of them actually ended up getting married, and Carol moved into his ranch home and moved her two daughters in as well. So now they were like a little bit of a family. And also around this same time, Gacy set himself up his own business. He became a contractor, doing loads of stuff. Loads of like random little jobs, like building jobs, landscaping jobs, gardening jobs, any little like manual labour thing that the townspeople needed doing, he would do it. I actually have a list of all the jobs that he did. He was a jack of all trades. He did painting, decorating, maintenance, repairs, landscaping, and that's it. That's all I've got on my list. But that's a lot. And he was booked and busy with this job, obviously because all the townspeople loved him. He was a very, very popular man where he lived now. And so this is the kind of job that does well with like word of mouth and like recommendations and stuff. So he was booked. He was quickly earning a lot of money, like almost as much money as he was earning as a KFC manager. And this made him very, very happy. Eventually, he became so booked and busy that he had to start hiring other employees to like help him out, do jobs with him, or do other jobs at the same time as him, because he couldn't be in two places at once. And he was getting, like, he had so much demand. But surprise, surprise, many of these employees, well, if not all of these employees that he was hiring, were teenage boys. And history repeated itself in exactly the way that you might imagine. He would invite these employees round to his house out of hours, get them drunk, and proposition them for sex. This would often be in return for money or even promotions or like extra work, extra jobs if they would have sex with him. And sometimes the boys would oblige because they wanted these promotions, they wanted the money. And in the cases where they would still turn him down, John Wayne Gacy would find other ways to make them comply. He would make up some random reason as to why his employee might owe him money, a lot of money. It would usually be a very high figure that the boy wouldn't be able to pay off. And when the employee would start panicking, saying like, oh, I don't have that kind of money, I can't pay you back, John Wayne Gacy would say, oh, don't worry, you can repay in sexual favours instead. And some of these boys were as young as 14 years old, being forced into having sex with this 30-something-year-old man. And if the boys still tried to turn him down, even after the whole debt thing, then Gacy would remind them that he owned a lot of guns and he wasn't afraid to use them. On one occasion, he said to one of his victims, "Do you know how easy it would be for me to get one of my guns and kill you? How easy it would be to get rid of the body?" And in the end, these boys would always say yes to whatever Gacy wanted, which is so sad that he went to such lengths to threaten them into submission, literally threatening to kill them if they wouldn't have sex with him. In 1973, Gacy was contracted to do some work all the way in Florida, which was like an 18-hour drive away from where he lived. And he couldn't do this job in Florida alone. He needed to bring another employee along with him. It was a two-man job. So Gacy picked one of his teenage boy employees, and without telling this boy, Gacy booked them a hotel over in Florida for a few days, but they didn't have a bedroom each. They didn't even have a bed each. They would be sharing a double bed. A teenage boy and his 30-something-year-old boss. When they got to Florida and they got to this hotel room, the boy walked in and saw one double bed, and he was very shocked, but he didn't say anything because he didn't want to, he didn't want to be a pain. He didn't want to cause problems. You know, he was just going to sleep in the bed. It was only for a few nights, and then they would be home. But on their first night in that hotel room, John Wayne Gacy's intentions became very clear, and he raped his young employee. The next morning, when they woke up, Gacy just acted as if nothing happened. He got ready for work, told his employee to get ready for work, and then the two of them went out and did the job that they were contracted to be there for. They didn't talk about it, no one mentioned it, and they just carried on as if nothing had happened. And like I said, they were there in Florida for a few days. They were meeting up with the client, and they were seeing people, speaking to people, and this whole time the employee didn't say a word about what was going on in their hotel room to anyone. He was terrified of Gacy for so many different reasons as well. One, he'd obviously already raped him once and he can do it again. He also threatened to use guns several times with his employees, so he was scared of losing his life. And on top of that, there was the fact that Gacy could have literally just left this boy in Florida, 18 hours away from home. He could have just left him there all alone. Gacy was his ride home. So he had to be nice to him. So this employee said nothing. The whole time they were in Florida, he just kept his head down and just waited to get home. Eventually, they finished up this job in Florida and went back to Chicago. And the very next day, this employee was ready to get his revenge on John Wayne Gacy. The employee stormed over to Gacy's house, met him outside, and in front of his new wife, Carol, and her two kids, he beat up John Wayne Gacy hard. And Carol was so confused with what was going on. She knew that that was his employee, and she knew that that was the one that he'd just gone to Florida with. So now she was so confused why they were in an argument. As far as she was aware, they'd just gone and done the job, everything was fine, and they came home. So when the boy eventually left and Gacy came back inside all bloody and beaten, she starts asking him all these questions, like what the hell went on that business trip? And Gacy pretty much just told his wife that while they were away in Florida, he and his employee had gotten into a bit of a fight because he felt as though his employee wasn't working hard enough, and so he wasn't going to give his employee his full cut of the money, and so the employee was mad that he wasn't going to get paid enough, and so that was why he beat him up. And Carol just accepted it. She never knew the real reason why that happened. And that was kind of the end of that. As far as I'm aware, I don't think that employee went to the police about it, although he did distance himself from the company. He did still work for Gacy occasionally because he needed the money, but he hated Gacy, of course. He didn't want to see him, he didn't want to go near him. He would only accept jobs when he was desperate for money. When John Wayne Gacy was 33 years old, he finally came out to his wife as bisexual. And I think his wife was pretty chill about it, as far as I could read up on. But later that same night, the two of them had sex, and when they were done, Gacy turned to her and said, "We're never doing that again. That's the last time we're ever gonna do that." He said he still wanted to be with her. He still liked her. He still wanted to be married to her and live with her and whatever, but he didn't want to have sex with her. He said that it made him uncomfortable. He didn't enjoy it, so he wasn't gonna do it anymore. And from this point on, Gacy started going on a lot more work trips, and he was going out with his employees a lot and not coming home the same night. And Carol knew what was going on. Like, she wasn't stupid. She knew that her husband was cheating on her with other men, mainly his employees. But she didn't say anything about it for a while, I think because she didn't have any proof. She was waiting to get some proof though. So Carol starts spying on her husband. Whenever he would go out with his employees on a night, or like he would go out on a business trip, she would wait up for him to return and she would watch out of the window. And every time he would return home, it would be with a younger boy, a teenage boy. And he thought that his wife would just be asleep at this point. So he wasn't really trying to hide it. He would just bring these boys home, get out of the car with them. They would usually go into the garage because he'd set up the garage as his little man cave, you know? So Carol would watch as Gacy and these boys went into the garage, and then a few hours later, he would come and crawl into bed next to her as if nothing had happened. So now she knew that something was up and she needed more proof. And so her next move was to go into that garage and see what evidence she could find. She wanted to know what her husband and these young boys were getting up to in that garage. I think she already knew, but she needed proof, like I said. So she went in there and she found stacks and stacks and stacks of gay porn magazines. She even found a couple of boys' IDs just laying around in the garage. And these IDs, of course, all had the boys' birthdays on, which told her just how young a lot of her husband's friends were. Teenagers. Carol ended up confronting her husband about this, and they argued and argued and argued repeatedly for months about this. Carol wasn't going to let it go, and Gacy somehow had a rebuttal for every argument that she had. She could never win these arguments against him, and eventually Gacy had had enough of her getting on his back about it, essentially, and he suggested that they just get a divorce. If she's so bothered about him cheating on her with children, then they should just get a divorce. Carol agreed that this wasn't the marriage that she wanted, nor was it the marriage that she thought she was getting herself into a couple of years ago. And so she packed her things, took her 2 daughters, and left. After his wife left, John Wayne Gacy threw himself into his work. I mean, he'd already been working 12-hour days before this, but now he was working 15-hour days. Literally, the only time he stopped was to sleep or to drink. He barely even noticed his wife's absence in his life. She really, towards the end of that relationship, he barely even saw her, barely even spoke to her. So it was as if nothing really changed. That same year, John Wayne Gacy decided that it was time for something new in his life. And one thing about that man, he loved a good club, a good organisation, a good group of men that he could be a part of. And so he went out and he found himself a new club. And that was when he was made aware of a new club that was going on in town. It was called the Jolly Joker Club. And this was a group of men that would try to help out the community. They would do fundraising, they would go help out at children's hospitals, they would do children's parties for free, all while dressed up as clowns. And clowns in this day and age, in 2022, they are horrifying. They are creepy. They are, they have so many negative connotations because of horror movies and stuff. But at this point in time, in the 1970s, everyone loved a good clown. They were at all the kids' birthday parties. They were quite normal. So yeah, John Wayne Gacy joined the Jolly Jokers Club and he became a clown. And he set himself up 2 little characters. He had one character named Pogo the Clown, which was the one that he used more often than not. And Pogo was just your typical clown. He was jolly, he was good vibes, he was funny, he was silly. But then he had his other character named Patches. And Patches was the complete opposite of Pogo. Patches was very serious. He was very, almost depressed, kind of miserable. He was a bit of a mopey clown. So you can already tell that Gacy is taking this clown stuff very, very seriously. He has planned himself out 2 different characters with 2 different personalities, 2 different looks. He is really into this clown stuff already. He would spend all of his spare time thinking about his new clown hobby. He would design new outfits, sew them up. He would think about different face paint designs that he could do. And one of the main things that he loved about being a clown in the Jolly Jokers Club is that it allowed him to regress back into his childhood. I think that's how he put it. And that he never really had a childhood when he was younger because he was always so badly abused by his father that now he felt that he could finally like live out that lost childhood as an adult. And Gacy loved being a clown so much that he would do all of his clown work for free. I mean, he didn't need any more money. He was very, very rich with his contracting business. It was very big now. He had a lot of employees under him that he was earning money through as well. He didn't need any extra money, and he just loved being a clown, so he would just go out and do it for free. He would go to kids' hospitals, cheer up the kids on the ward. He would do birthday parties for free. And it also gave everyone else in the town just another reason to love John Wayne Gacy, because he was doing all their kids' parties for free. Just another thing that Gacy is doing for the community. He would shovel the snow, he would mow the lawns, he would be the clown at the party. He was a full package. So he's doing this clown gig for a couple of hours a week, but like I said, he was working a lot, like 15-hour days some days. He did not have much spare time, and that was what he wanted. He wanted to free up more time for clowning around, I guess. So he starts hiring on a lot more employees, like a lot, and they're obviously all young teenage boys. And one of the next employees that he hired was a 15-year-old boy named Anthony Antonucci. 2 months into working for Gacy, Anthony called in sick one morning and said that he'd really injured his ankle the day before, on his shift the day before, and so today he wasn't going to be able to go in and work. So Gacy was like, hope you're okay, I'll pop round later with a little get well soon gift. So Anthony Antonucci is home alone when Gacy knocks on his door with the get well soon gift, a bottle of alcohol for a 15-year-old boy. Gacy insisted that Anthony let him in and the two of them share the bottle of alcohol. And obviously Anthony said yes. I mean, he didn't want to disappoint his boss. So yeah, this young boy, I think this was like the first time he'd ever had alcohol. So he got pretty wasted pretty quickly. And as the two of them were drinking, Gacy pulled out another gift for Anthony from his bag, a porn magazine. And Anthony had never seen porn before. It was like a VHS tape. And so Gacy went and put on the movie for them, and they sat and watched it, and they finished this bottle of alcohol. And when they did, it was very clear that Anthony was very, very intoxicated. And so Gacy knew that now it was time for him to put his full plan into action. He reached down into his bag and pulled out some handcuffs. He turned to Anthony, grabbed both of his hands, shoved them behind his back, and handcuffed him so he couldn't move, he couldn't run away. Gacy didn't say a word to Anthony. He didn't tell him why he'd just done that, but Gacy stood up and went outside to his car. He must have forgotten something in his car. But what he didn't realise was that Anthony wasn't actually fully handcuffed. One of the cuffs hadn't closed properly, so Anthony was able to undo that one. So now he wasn't bound, really. He just had floppy handcuffs on one of his wrists. But quickly, Anthony came up with a plan. He knew that when Gacy returned, he had to still look like he was handcuffed. He didn't want Gacy to be suspicious. And so he stayed there, even though he was free, he stayed there with his hands behind his back. When Gacy returned to the room, Anthony stayed with his hands behind his back until Gacy came and stood about here. And once he was close enough, Anthony attacked. He grabbed Gacy's legs and completely flipped him in the air in some sort of wrestling move. And once Gacy was down on the floor, Anthony kept hold of his legs so he couldn't go anywhere. Gacy was trying to wriggle, trying to get up, but he couldn't move. And Anthony was rummaging around in his pockets, and eventually he found the key to the other side of the handcuffs. He unlocked his other hand from them, so now he was fully free from these handcuffs. And then somehow, this 15-year-old boy managed to wrestle this 30-something-year-old fully grown man into the handcuffs and locked him in them. He managed to handcuff John Wayne Gacy, his attacker, and he was just laid on the floor. And the whole time Gacy is screaming at him, threatening him to unlock him from those handcuffs or he was going to kill him. But Anthony knew that he was safe as long as those handcuffs were locked. And so he just stood back. He just stood back and waited for John Wayne Gacy to calm down. Eventually, when Gacy stopped screaming, the two of them had a conversation for, I think, a couple of hours. They were talking about this for a while, and by the end of the conversation, Gacy seemed very embarrassed and remorseful. And he promised Anthony that if he just unlocked him, just took the handcuffs off him, then he would leave and he wouldn't cause any more issues. And Anthony believed him, so he unlocked the handcuffs, and Gacy stuck to his word. He got up and he left. But then Anthony had to see Gacy at work every day. That was his boss. And actually Gacy kept referencing what had gone on between them at work. It's almost as if he thought it was some sort of like flirty little inside joke between the two of them. He would say things like, not only are you the one who got out of the cuffs, you got them on me. And you can see the complete disconnect from his actions there, especially in that statement. This is a 15-year-old child that you handcuffed in order to do some heinous things to him, probably traumatized him to his core, and now you just drop in flirty little teasing little comments about it during the workday. Not only that, but that comment there suggested that Anthony wasn't the first and only person that Gacy had done this to, and he certainly wouldn't be the last either. Gacy then laid low again for about a year until July of 1976, when he was driving down the highway one day when he passed a hitchhiker and decided to pick him up. This hitchhiker was an 18-year-old boy named David Cram. I believe David was a runaway, although I'm not entirely sure, but either way, as the two of them were driving, they got talking, got to know each other, and David mentioned that he needed a job. And Gacy just lit up at the thought of this. Immediately, he's like, oh, I have a contracting company. Come work with us. We need more employees, boys exactly like you, strong boys that can do this, and that, da-da-da-da. And David thought this was amazing. He was literally being offered a job on a silver platter by some guy that seemed really helpful, really kind. And so, yeah, David took the job. They worked together for about a month, and as Gacy was getting to know David Cram more and more, he realised that he didn't have anywhere to stay. And so Gacy actually offered David Cram one of the spare bedrooms in his house, because he had a few now that his wife and kids had left. David happily agreed to move in because this guy seemed like Jesus right now. He had offered him a job, a place to stay. This guy was sorting him right out. So yeah, David moved in a day before his 19th birthday. And so the night that he moved in, the two of them decided to celebrate, and they got really, really, really drunk. And actually, for David Cram's birthday, John Wayne Gacy decided to dress up as Pogo the Clown. Because what's a birthday without a clown? A 19th birthday as well. Once the two of them were really, really drunk, Gacy once again reached for his handcuffs and handcuffed David's hands in front of him this time. And then he grabbed the chain between the cuffs and started swinging David around the room by the chain of the handcuffs. Immediately, David didn't like this. He was screaming, he was begging Gacy to stop, but Gacy just responded by telling David that he was going to rape him. And this must have sent like a shock of adrenaline through David's body, and somehow he got the strength to pull away from Gacy and kick him in the face. And this was a pretty hard kick as well. Like, Gacy went flying across the room, and he was like down on the floor, giving David enough time to run over, rummage through his pockets, and find the key for the handcuffs. He managed to get the handcuffs off of his hands. Gacy, at this point, wasn't trying to, chase after him or get him back or anything. David took the handcuffs off and just went to bed in his separate bedroom where he lived in Gacy's house. And that was that for the evening. David was forced to sleep in the same house as this man that had just threatened to rape him. He had no other choice. He had nowhere else to go. He just had to kind of hope that Gacy wasn't going to try again. And David stayed living there as well after that night. He tried to stay out of Gacy's way most of the time. But yeah, I think they just kind of carried on as if nothing happened. About a month after that incident, so they hadn't really talked about it again after that, but a month later, in the middle of the night, David Cram woke up to see Gacy standing in his doorway, and he said to him, "Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you gave me what I want." He then tried to rape David Cram for a second time, but David fought back, managed to get Gacy down on the floor and pinned him down until he calmed down and promised that he wouldn't do anything. Once he felt like he was no longer in danger, David got off of Gacy, like unpinned him down? What's the word for that? Anyway, he got off him, and as Gacy left the room, he turned to David and said, "You ain't no fun." And after this second attempt, David knew that he could not live or work with John Wayne Gacy anymore. He just couldn't. It was too dangerous. So the next morning, David Cram left and he went to go and live and work somewhere else. But Gacy didn't see this as a loss exactly. In fact, he saw it as an opportunity to get a new lodger in the house. So he moved another one of his employees into the house. This time it was 18-year-old Michael Rossi. He moved into David Cram's old bedroom, and weirdly enough, Gacy actually got Michael Rossi to join the Jolly Jokers Club as well. So not only is this guy his employee, his roommate, and also now his clown friend. They were out doing clown stuff together. We don't actually have many details about Michael Rossi's time living with John Wayne Gacy, although we can imagine it was probably quite similar to David Cram's. And I just want to take a moment right now to step back and remind you exactly who John Wayne Gacy is, or who he seems to be to the rest of the community, because we've been talking about all the horrible things that he does. But bear in mind, the neighborhood doesn't know about any of that. To them, he was this great guy that worked hard, super successful, huge contracting business, like the contracting business in that area. He was the guy that you went to if you needed something doing. He was so well respected, so well known. He would have been a millionaire in today's money. Probably a multi-millionaire by the end of the case, I'm pretty sure. He was powerful, he was untouchable, no one could go against him. He had political connections, he had politician friends. Gacy was very, very good at manipulating and persuading people, and he was seen as a great guy, very charitable. He would do all the clown stuff in children's hospitals for free. Everyone loved him. So no one expected that he would be doing all of this heinous stuff behind closed doors. And I think that's one of the main reasons why he was able to get away with all of this for so long, because people just couldn't believe any little suspicions that they had. People would just talk themselves out of it, like, oh no, of course not John Wayne Gacy. He's a great guy. He would never do that. In 1978, John Wayne Gacy was about 36 years old at this point, and he had another client. This time it was a pharmacy owner, and he was called there to this pharmacy to talk about remodeling it. And while he was at this pharmacy, he clocked the young boy that was working at the cashier, 15-year-old Robert Priest, and immediately Gacy was taken with this young boy. And so he started planning how he was gonna get him. While speaking to the store manager, Gacy started talking loud enough that he knew that Robert Priest at the cashier would be able to hear him. And he starts bragging. Gacy asked the pharmacy guy about wages and how much he pays his staff. And when the guy responded, Gacy seemed so shocked and horrified, and he was like, "What? What do you mean? I pay my workers 5 times that." Which of course sparked young Robert Priest's interest in the conversation. At about 9 p.m. that night, Robert Priest's mother came to pick him up from his work, and Robert ran outside with his coat. He seemed super excited, and he said to his mum, "Some contractor wants to talk to me about a job." And so his mum was like, "Okay, go talk to him." And she agreed to wait outside in her car for her son to come back. She waited about 15 minutes and Robert wasn't coming back. And actually it was her birthday that day, his mum's birthday. And they were all planning to have a family meal when they got home. And so she was getting a bit impatient, and eventually she got out of the car and went inside the pharmacy to go and find her son. But when she got inside, he wasn't there. In fact, no one was. The pharmacy was completely empty. And so she went back out into the car park and she's running around looking for her son, but he is nowhere to be found. So now, panicked beyond belief, his mother raced home and spent the rest of her birthday filling out a missing persons report for her young son. So police got straight on the case, starting obviously at the pharmacy where he was last seen. They went there, they spoke to the store manager, and of course, because of the conversation that Robert had had with his mum, saying that he was going to go speak to a contractor, police asked the store owner if they knew anything about a contractor. Of course, he did. He'd been speaking to John Wayne Gacy all day, so he gave over the name John Wayne Gacy. So the police officers that were put on Robert's missing persons case, right from the beginning, they thought that he had been abducted. That was the main theory. And of course, this contractor seemed like the top suspect. So police got looking into this contractor, this John Wayne Gacy. They typed his name in on their little police system, and even though his criminal record was white, it was obviously still available to police. So they typed in his name, and they found all these previous convictions and accusations of sexual assault against children. And as soon as they saw that, they knew they had to be on the right track. I mean, the victim in his previous conviction was around the same age. Donald Voorhees was 15, and so was Robert Priest. This was his exact victim type. And so once they saw this, a full investigation was launched into John Wayne Gacy. So police found Gacy's address on the system and they went straight to his house to go and speak to him. And the conversation started off well, to be honest. Gacy admitted that he had been at the pharmacy that day and that he had seen Robert Priest in the pharmacy, but he denied ever speaking to him. In fact, his full story was that he didn't speak to anyone other than the store owner while he was there. He said he went into the pharmacy, spoke to the store owner about the remodeling, and then left straight away. Like, didn't do anything else, didn't dilly-dally, just that. He did say that a couple of hours after he left, he realised that he'd left his notebook at the pharmacy, and so he drove back to the pharmacy, picked up the notebook, again, only spoke to the store manager, literally just said hi, and then left again. But police weren't very satisfied with Gacy's version of events here, and so they asked him if he would come back to the police station with him for a proper official interview. But Gacy actually refused. And I mean, he was allowed to do that because he wasn't arrested, but it doesn't look good, does it? He actually told police that his uncle had passed away that morning, and so his family actually really needed him right now. So police weren't exactly gonna force him to come down for a questioning on the same day that his uncle died. In fact, Gacy did tell them that he would stop by at the police station later on, but right now, he needed to be with his family. So police were like, okay, cool. What time do you think you can come down to the police station? And when they asked that, Gacy got a little bit pissed off. He snapped at the officers saying, "You guys are very rude. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" And then he told them to leave his house. Gacy eventually did make his way to the police station in the early hours of the morning, weirdly enough. He turned up at the police station at 2:30 a.m. and he was covered in mud. For some reason. Police asked him what had happened, why he was covered in mud, and Gacy said that he'd been in a car accident, but he didn't want to talk about it, and he was okay. Odd. So police just kind of let it go. I mean, they just let him be weird because really all they cared about was 15-year-old Robert Priest. They wanted to know where he was. They didn't care why he was covered in mud. So they asked Gacy to reiterate his whole story, exactly what he'd done that day, and he told the exact same story again, that he went to the pharmacy, only spoke to the store owner, left, forgot his diary, went back, only spoke to the store owner, and left again. So police asked Gacy, oh, how did you know that you'd left your notebook at the pharmacy and not somewhere else, not at one of your other appointments? And Gacy said that it was because the store owner had actually called him up and been like, oh, you left your notebook, I've got your notebook. And immediately, police knew that this was a lie because the store owner had told them that he hadn't spoken to Gacy since he left. So it seems that Gacy actually came back for his diary off his own accord. But why did he have to lie? Why did he have to tell police that the store owner had called him when he hadn't? But police didn't let on to Gacy that they knew that he was lying right now. They just kind of let him keep lying. And they let him lie in his statement as well. They let him leave the police station that night thinking that he was in the clear. Thinking that no one was suspicious of him, that he had just told his story and everything was fine. But of course, this only made police 1,000,000 times more suspicious the fact that he'd lied. And it was a seemingly very small, insignificant lie as well. Why do you need to lie about where your notebook is or how you realised that your notebook was lost? You know? Odd thing to lie about unless it's connected to a bigger lie. But to be fair, that didn't matter right now because police thought that John Wayne Gacy was an abductor and they thought that he probably had Robert Priest back at his house. So with this in mind, police obtained a search warrant for John Wayne Gacy's house that they received 2 days after Robert Priest went missing. So they rocked up and knocked on Gacy's door completely unannounced with their search warrant in hand. Gacy had no time to prepare, he had no time to hide anything, he just had to let them in and let them search. And this search was very revealing. They found a lot of suspicious stuff, and I just have a whole honker of a list here, so I'm just going to read everything out. They found a 6mm pistol, several fake police badges with various different names on them, several driving licenses belonging to different young men, a high school ring from the class of 1975 engraved with the initials JAS, a syringe and a hypodermic needle, a load of random drugs, recreational drugs, hallucinogenics, opiates, I don't know, loads of random drugs. They found handcuffs, nylon rope, loads of different pornographic films. They actually found 2 books with very similar storylines of like an older man falling for a teenage boy, like a boy that is not legal. They found an 18-inch dildo, underwear, and a blue parka coat, both of which were too small to fit John Wayne Gacy, suggesting that they were someone else's. And finally, a receipt from the pharmacy where Robert Priest worked was found in the jacket pocket that they found. Initially, police were very, very interested in that receipt because it seemingly proved that John Wayne Gacy's story was a lie. He said that he had gone to the pharmacy and only spoken to the store owner. But if he had a receipt that proved that he had paid for something, then surely that meant he would have spoken to the cashier. And who was the cashier? 15-year-old Robert Priest. So this only added to the suspicion against John Wayne Gacy. It seemed that he had lied a lot in his interview. After this search, police decided to look into Gacy's company, his contracting company, and all of his different employees. And they actually found that one of his employees, a young man named Charles Hatula, had tragically passed away not long before this. He was found drowned to death in a river, and it's completely unknown how he got there, how he drowned, why he was there. And now it just seemed very weird, paired with the suspicious circumstances that they were investigating now. And there was also another, suspicious circumstance connected to Gacy. Weird. So police had seized all the items that I listed earlier that they found in his house. And they were very interested in that high school ring with the initials JAS engraved on it. Who was JAS? Because it obviously wasn't John Wayne Gacy. So again, they looked into it. They got in contact with the school and they really analysed this ring. And they found that it belonged to a boy named John Schick. And at this point in time, John Schick was missing. Another weird, suspicious circumstance relating to John Wayne Gacy. Death, tragedy, and disappearance seem to just follow this man wherever he goes. John Schick's parents hadn't heard from him in weeks and they were so worried about him. So now that police are starting to piece together weird corners of Gacy's life, they're very suspicious about him and they decided to put him on 24-hour surveillance. They wanted to see what this man was up to in his day-to-day life and they needed to keep tabs on him in case tragedy, death, and disappearance kept following him. And being under 24-hour surveillance very quickly irritated John Wayne Gacy. It got under his skin something shocking because he already hated the police for obvious reasons because they tried to put a stop to every awful thing that he did. So obviously he didn't like them. But he always felt like he was above the police. He looked down on the police and he always thought that he could outdo them. And so actually, Gacy went about this in quite an interesting way. He decided to try and befriend the surveillance officers that were watching him. He was super, super friendly with them. He would always go outside, spark up conversation with them, even invite them into his house for a drink, which they would more often than not, well, actually all the time, they would turn it down because that's highly inappropriate to go for a drink in this guy's house who they think is a murderer. Probably a murderer. In the end, Gacy got so miffed off with this 24-hour surveillance that he actually started accusing police of specifically targeting him due to his political affiliation. I don't know though. No one really believed it because there's evidence, man. There is evidence as to why they have you on surveillance, because weird shit surrounds you. It's not because you're a politician. So yeah, now Gacy's getting so miffed off with this surveillance that he starts like taking the piss with it. He starts taking the mick out of these officers. So he would like go and get in his car at random times during the night, knowing that these police had to follow him wherever he went. So he would just take them on wild goose chases. He would go wherever he wanted. He would like try and swerve around and try and lose them and just generally try and make the surveillance officers' lives harder. Just because he could. So as all of this surveillance stuff was going on, the other police officers were trying to find any evidence that they possibly could against John Wayne Gacy. And so they were speaking to everyone in his life. Family, well, he didn't really have much family around him anymore, did he? But like people that used to be his family, employees, and even people that he had rented out his bedrooms to, although there was no rent involved, his lodgers, you know, the boys that he let sleep in his spare room. First up was David Cram, the first of the lodgers, you know, the hitchhiker that he picked up off the side of the road and then attempted to rape twice before David had to run away and leave the company because his boss kept trying to rape him. At the time, David had never reported either of those incidents, but now that police had come to him and started asking about Gacy, he was willing to tell him every detail that he could remember. On top of the multiple cases of attempted sexual assault, David Cram also remembered something else really weird about his time living at Gacy's house. So one day, David was just chilling in the house and Gacy approached him and said that he had a gift for him. He put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a watch. And it was supposed to be like a bit of a jokey present because David Cram was really bad at timekeeping. He was always late to things. And so Gacy was like, look, I got you a watch so you won't be late anymore. So David laughed and he was like, oh, where did you get this from? And Gacy responded, from a dead person. David just thought it was like a really weird, dark joke at the time. But now that police had come to him because they thought that this guy was genuinely really dangerous, David now thought back to that incident and thought, oh my God, what if there was some truth in that? What if he had actually stolen some dead guy's watch? But that wasn't the only thing that now seemed weird in retrospect. David was remembering loads of weird stories about John Wayne Gacy. Like, for example, one time when the police came to search his house, actually, Gacy wasn't there at the time, but he came back to the house once the police had left. And as soon as he walked in, he saw mud all over the floors inside his house. And this sent him into panic mode. Gacy went pale as a ghost because he feared that this mud all over the floor meant the police had found his secret trenches, secret passageway under the house. And this is when police learned, right, David Cram sat there and told the police that for months, John Wayne Gacy had him digging out trenches, like underground passages, underneath the house. Gacy told David at the time that it was for like drainage or something. I don't know, he gave him quite a sound reason and David didn't think too much of it, but the way that Gacy panicked when he came back to the house suggested that those trenches were not for drainage and perhaps they had a much more sinister reason for existing. These underground trenches, this like passageway, is referred to in this case as the crawl space. So if I keep calling it the crawl space, those are the trenches that David Cram and actually someone else dug, but we'll get there in a minute. So yeah, as soon as Gacy came back that day and he saw this mud all over the house, he flipped out, panicked, and had to go and check the crawl space for evidence of digging because he needed to see if the police had gone there. But when Gacy returned from the crawl spaces afterwards, David Cram said that he seemed significantly calmer, so he must not have found any evidence of digging, I guess. Police had no idea about this crawl space, these passageways underneath the house. David Cram telling them this was the first they'd ever heard of this. They hadn't found them by themselves. They had no idea they existed. And that was everything that David Cram could really tell police about John Wayne Gacy. He told them about all his personal incidents that he had with him and some other super weird stuff as well. So now police were even more eager to speak to the other lodger that Gacy had had in his house before, Michael Rossi. And Michael had some very, very similar stories to David Cram. Like, for example, one day, Michael was just chilling in the house and Gacy came home with a new car, a random car that Michael had never seen before. So he went out and he was like, oh, where'd you get this from? And Gacy couldn't really give him a straight answer. He just didn't really answer. We'll come back to that car a little bit later on in the case, but Michael had so much more to tell police. Like, he was also involved in the digging of the trenches underneath the house, although at a separate time to David Cram. They didn't work on them together. Apparently, John Wayne Gacy had been very, very strict about where the boys could and couldn't dig. Basically, the trenches that he wanted were about 6 foot long, 2 foot deep and 2 foot wide, which is about the same dimensions as a human grave, by the way. And Michael Rossi had also been instructed to lay about 10 bags of lime in these trenches. And a little science lesson for you now. Lime is very alkaline, and when it mixes with water, it makes calcium hydroxide, which is an incredibly corrosive substance. Just 1 drop of calcium hydroxide on your skin can cause like a chemical burn, and it is used in a lot of murder cases to dissolve bodies, to dissolve evidence. But lime is also used in construction jobs and landscaping jobs, and what was John Wayne Gacy? A damn contractor. So when he was ordering 10 bloody big bags of lime, no one questioned it. He could get hold of it so easily. So after speaking to David Cram and Michael Rossi, police had a lot of interesting information against Gacy, but they still had a lot more that needed investigating as well. A lot more. They were very, very interested in that pharmacy receipt that they found in that jacket pocket in his house. In a jacket that didn't belong to John Wayne Gacy, might I add, because the jacket was way too small for him. Interesting. They thought that this receipt in the pocket proved Gacy's story to be a lie, but as they started looking into it, it seemed a lot more complicated than they originally thought. Turns out, the receipt wasn't actually Gacy's. It actually belonged to a young girl, a 17-year-old Kimberly Byers, who actually worked at the pharmacy. I'm not entirely sure how they found out that it was her receipt, but I don't know, police have their ways, don't they, I guess. So they went to go and speak to Kimberly Byers about how her receipt could have ended up in John Wayne Gacy's house. So she told them that she'd actually borrowed Robert Priest, 15-year-old Robert Priest's jacket that day when she was at work. She just needed to run outside and grab something and it was quite cold. So she chucked on his jacket and then she went inside the store, bought something, got that receipt, put it in the pocket of Robert's jacket, and then took off the jacket because she was done. She didn't need it anymore. And now police found that jacket and that receipt in John Wayne Gacy's house. And now they knew that it was Robert's jacket. Suddenly, everything was making sense. Robert would have been wearing that jacket when he was abducted by Gacy. That's how it ended up there. So they asked Kimberly to try and describe this jacket to them, and she gave a description that completely matched this jacket in the house. It proved that it was Robert's. So they'd found his clothes, but there was no sign of Robert at the house at all. At this point, let me just remind you that John Wayne Gacy is still under 24-hour surveillance by police, and still no sign of Robert. They haven't seen Robert with him or anything like that, but Gacy himself is displaying some very, very weird behaviour. He'd pretty much let himself go at this point in time. He'd stopped looking after himself, stopped showering, personal hygiene completely out the window. He was unshaven. He wasn't changing his clothes every day. He was dirty. He was grotty. He looked tired, very, very tired, as if he wasn't sleeping properly, as if he wasn't, just looking after himself. And he was also seen drinking at all different times of day. Like, the surveillance police officers saw him getting drunk most days. By December 18th, 1978, Gacy had enough of this constant police surveillance. And so he led those surveillance officers on yet another wild goose chase in his car, but this time he went to his lawyer's office. Gacy stormed straight into his lawyer's office and just told them that he couldn't take it anymore. The police surveillance was making him so anxious that he wanted to sue them. So he and his lawyer sat in that office and drafted up a $750,000 lawsuit that demanded that police stop surveillance immediately. Little did he know that as he was trying to sort out this lawsuit, police were also trying to sort out another search warrant for Gacy's home. So they didn't know, but they were like racing against each other to see who could get their thing sorted first. Because whoever was done first won, essentially. So a court date was set for Gacy's lawsuit on December 22nd, in 3 days' time from when they drafted the lawsuit. So that meant that police had 3 days to get this search warrant sorted and go and search the house. It really was a race against time. This also meant that they might only have 3 more days of surveillance. They might actually have to stop the 24-hour surveillance if this lawsuit goes to plan. So the surveillance officers knew that they needed to see something. They needed to get something against John Wayne Gacy quick. But how were they going to do that? How were they going to coax something out of him? The very next day, on December 19th, John Wayne Gacy was acting normal again. He seemed to be fine on this particular day. He went outside his house, started speaking to surveillance officers, as he often did, and again, he invited them into his house for a drink. And the surveillance officers always turned him down. Always, because it's just inappropriate for them to go in and have a drink with him. But at this point, they were desperate. They knew they didn't have much time left, and they needed to get some information on this man. And so on this particular day, they were like, all right, yeah, we'll come in for a drink. They were being voluntarily let inside their suspect's home. To be fair, I feel like it might have been a good idea for them to go in before now, but anyway, it was like having a free search warrant, really, wasn't it? Although they're not really allowed to search. I suppose they can look with their eyes. But anyway, the police got inside the house anyway. So they went and sat in the living room, and they were just having quite an irrelevant chat, because obviously this wasn't an interview, it wasn't a questioning, they couldn't really ask him about the murder. So they were just asking him about like boring, irrelevant stuff, his job, his clown stuff that he does. At one point during this conversation, one of the officers excused himself and went to the bathroom. And, everything was cool. He went to the bathroom, as one does. And then he flushed the toilet. And that was when things got weird. All of a sudden, when the toilet flushed, this foul odour just filled the room. It was as if that flush had like triggered it, and this horrid smell just like came out of the toilet. But it wasn't like a toilet smell. You know what I mean? It wasn't like a bathroom kind of smell. In fact, the officer knew exactly what that smell was. It was the smell of human decomposition. And apparently, human decomposition is one of those smells that humans just kind of instinctively know. I mean, this officer had smelt that smell before because he'd worked on homicide cases before, but it's supposedly, I mean, I've never smelt it before myself, but it's supposedly one of those smells that you smell it and like instinctively it is built into us to know what that is, to be able to like protect ourselves or whatever. And apparently if you've smelt it before, it's one of those smells that you like never forget. And so as soon as this officer smelt human decomposition, like taking over the room, he knew that they had to crack down on this investigation. This was something that they hadn't noticed in the search before, because when they went and searched his house and they found that big list of items that I talked about earlier, none of the officers had gone to the toilet. So no one had flushed the toilet, so no one had like triggered this smell in the house. But now they were realizing that something must be going on underneath the house, you know, within the sewage and the pipes and that, you know. So once the police officers left Gacy's house that night, this officer raised the alarm with everyone else on the team because he feared that maybe that was the smell of Robert Priest's dead body, and maybe his body was buried underground somewhere near the toilet, and so the flush had like triggered that smell to come up. So now that second search warrant that police were trying to get could not come quick enough, because now they knew exactly where to look. They had a plan. Once they got that search warrant, they were going to go underground, under that bathroom, because they needed to know where that smell was coming from. But the investigation was about to take a very unexpected turn less than 24 hours later. The next day was December 20th. John Wayne Gacy drove himself to his lawyer's office once again on the premise of talking about this lawsuit that they had in the works. But when he got there, he looked just awful, honestly. Like I said, he was disheveled, he was unshaven, unshowered, he smelled, he was in like dirty clothes. And as soon as he got to his lawyer's office, he asked for an alcoholic drink. And I think it was the morning time. And this was a request that his lawyer wouldn't usually fulfill. He wouldn't usually get his client an alcoholic drink in the middle of the day. But looking at John Wayne Gacy, he felt like Gacy needed one. So the lawyer went out to his car. He had a bottle of whiskey, I think, in his car, and he brought it back into the office and poured Gacy a drink. As he was drinking this glass of whiskey, Gacy picked up a newspaper that was on his lawyer's desk. And on the front page of this newspaper was a big picture of Robert Priest with the words "missing" right above it. Gacy was quite drunk at this point. He must have been drinking that morning before he got to the lawyer's office. But anyway, he was looking at this newspaper, looked at this missing poster of Robert Priest, slammed the newspaper down on the table and just pointed at it and said, "This boy's dead. He's in a river." John Wayne Gacy then went on to tell his lawyer a horrific story of deceit, sexual assault, abduction, murder, everything that he had been doing in secret for years that no one knew about. In a drunken haze, Gacy admitted to his lawyer that he had murdered countless teenage boys. He described them all as male prostitutes, hustlers, liars. He described himself as the judge, the jury, and executioner of many, many people. He described how he had sexually assaulted, raped, and murdered every single one of these teenage boys and then hidden their corpses in the crawl space underneath his house. He said that most of his victims were buried in one big mass grave underneath his home, and he'd just been living on top of it for years now. But he also told his lawyer that the last 5 of his victims he couldn't fit in the crawl space. He had filled up this mass grave under his house, so the last 5 of his victims, their bodies were in a local river. Gacy described to his lawyer what he called the rope trick, where he would supposedly wake up in the morning and find dead, strangled kids on the floor of his bedroom, but supposedly he wouldn't know how they got there, how it happened, who the kids were. And midway through this confession to his lawyer, John Wayne Gacy just passes out. He was so drunk that he just knocked out, and his lawyer's just looking at him like, it's clear that the police surveillance that he had been under for so long had really, really gotten to him. Like, he was so anxious and stressed about it that he was getting so drunk to be able to like deal with it as a coping mechanism. And it seemed that today he had reached his breaking point. He had gotten so drunk that it still wasn't taking the stress away. So he had to come and confess all of this to his lawyer. Well, half of it, because he passed out in the middle. So once Gacy had passed out, of course his lawyer tried to wake him up, couldn't wake him up because he was proper like, well, you know when someone passes out from alcohol, they're like, they're out, there's no waking them up. So he decided that he was gonna let Gacy just kind of sleep it off, and in the meantime, his lawyer called up a doctor, a psychiatrist, and booked in an assessment for Gacy first thing in the morning. And then the lawyer just sat in his office and waited for Gacy to wake up, and he was there for hours, until the next morning. It was literally until the next day. When he finally woke up the next day, Gacy had no memory of the whole confession that he'd given his lawyer the day before. Like, he couldn't remember anything that he said. He didn't even remember how he got to the lawyer's office. So now the lawyer had to recount all of Gacy's confession back to him. He had to tell Gacy that he had admitted to murdering over 30 different boys and men. And when the lawyer told him that, Gacy just froze. He didn't know how to respond. He couldn't believe that he had just admitted all of that to his lawyer. He just shook his head and said, well, I can't think about this right now. And then he stood up and left his lawyer's office. He knew that the lawyer had booked him a psychiatric assessment because he'd already told him when he woke up. So Gacy knew that he was walking away and leaving this appointment that had been made. But he didn't care. He didn't care that the doctor was on his way to the office right now. He didn't care. He was in a state of panic now after finding out that he had just admitted all of this. Obviously, when Gacy walked outside of his lawyer's office and got back into his car, the surveillance officers were still there. They'd been parked outside the lawyer's office all night waiting for Gacy to come out. So Gacy set off driving. I think he went to a gas station, filled up his car, and of course, the surveillance officers followed him there, watched him the whole time. And at this point, Gacy knew that he had just admitted to all of the murders to his lawyer, and he knew it was only a matter of time until that got back to the police. The lawyer was not going to keep that information to himself. There's no chance. Gacy knew that any moment now, this could all be over. And so he decided that he was going to have a little bit of fun with it while he still could. He went to this gas station, put the gas in his car, and then he went inside the little shop bit to go and pay for it. And he just pulled out a bag of weed and gave it to the cashier, knowing that the surveillance officers were watching and they could see this, but they weren't going to do anything about it because they were supposed to be watching him for murdery things, not for drugs. Yeah, he just handed it to this young girl behind the counter and just said, the end is coming. These guys are gonna kill me. The next thing John Wayne Gacy did, because he knew that the end was coming, he decided that he was gonna go and say all of his goodbyes to everyone that he loved, starting with one of his closest and longest friends, a man named Ronald Rhodes. He arrived at Ronald's house and just ran straight up to him, wrapped his arms around him, and gave him the biggest, longest hug ever, which Ronald found kind of weird because they weren't usually an affectionate pair. They didn't hug ever, especially not this long. Immediately, as soon as this hug started happening, Ronald knew that something big was happening because they'd never hugged like this before. Something must be going on, but he was not expecting what he was about to hear from Gacy. Halfway through this hug, Gacy just burst into tears, hysterical crying. He pulled away from the hug and he tried to speak, but he could barely get his words out. And then he ended up muttering the words, I've been a bad boy. I killed 30 people, give or take a few. I don't know what Ronald's response to this was. I really couldn't find much about this interaction. But after that, Gacy went and jumped back in his car and went to his next destination. And that next destination might actually surprise you. He wanted to go and meet up with his two former lodgers, David Cram and Michael Rossi. Of course, the surveillance officers followed him all the way there and they were watching him as he was driving, and it looked as though he was like praying. He kept grabbing his rosary beads and like holding them close, putting them on his chin. He seemed like he was praying. He was talking the whole time as he was driving. Of course, they couldn't hear what he was saying, but he seemed very, very distressed. Like they could tell that he was not in a good mental state at this point. So yeah, Gacy went to go and meet David and Michael. I don't know where he met them, and the surveillance officers really didn't see much of this because I think all the men went inside somewhere, so they didn't see what happened. They didn't hear any conversation. But the next thing the surveillance officers saw was all three of the men came out of wherever they were and they jumped into David Cram's car this time instead of Gacy's car. So now we'll flip to David's point of view. David is the one driving the car. Gacy demanded, actually, that David drive to another one of Gacy's lawyer's offices. I think he had like 2-3 lawyers, and he had a meeting scheduled there. So David drove him to the lawyer's office, and Gacy demanded that the two of them had to wait outside the office for him in that car for when he came back, because they then had to drive him somewhere else after that. So while Gacy was inside his lawyer's office in this appointment, David Cram got out of the car and went to go and speak to the surveillance officers that had been following Gacy for weeks. They asked David Cram what Gacy had been saying when they'd all gone inside that house, and of course the officers couldn't hear anything. And David Cram told them that Gacy had just confessed to killing around 30 people. The surveillance officers just told David and Michael to get back in the car. Don't let on to Gacy, when he comes out of that appointment, don't let on that they have said anything to the police. Just act normal, as if nothing just happened, as if that conversation between David and the police never happened. So Gacy, totally oblivious, comes out of this appointment, jumps right back in David's car in the passenger seat, and demands that David drive to the next destination, which was a cemetery. When he arrived, Gacy walked to his father's grave and sat beside it. And then his behaviour started to take a bit of a turn. He was talking to himself, although it was probably like talking to his father, I guess. But his voice was getting like louder and louder and more animated, more emotional as this conversation, one-sided conversation was going on. He was getting increasingly more erratic as he was sitting there. They could tell from just observing it. He was clearly still very drunk as well. And it was at this point that the surveillance officers started putting pieces together and they started realizing what Gacy was doing, that he was saying his final goodbyes to everyone that he loved, to his friend, and now to David and Michael, and now to his father's grave. So now the officers are thinking, well, why might he be saying his final goodbyes? Is it because he's about to take his own life? They knew they had to do something. If that was the way that it was going, they needed to do something before Gacy could kill himself. And so they called the police back at the station, their higher ups, and they basically told them the situation. Look, we think Gacy is on a suicide mission right now. He's saying his goodbyes. He might kill himself before the end of the day. What do we do? And the higher ups told them to just go in and arrest him because they can't risk him killing himself. They need to arrest him for the murders that they believe that he is responsible for. Luckily for the surveillance officers, because they'd seen him handing the weed to that gas station cashier earlier in the day, they had an excuse to arrest him that was completely separate to the murders. They could arrest him on this drug charge, get him down to the police station where he would then be under constant surveillance so he wouldn't be able to kill himself. Perfect. Actually, this was like the best case scenario because that meant that he wasn't under police surveillance, so the lawsuit didn't matter anymore. And then by the time they would be able to search his house and hopefully get evidence to be able to arrest him for the murders, they'd know exactly where he was. He'd be in the police station. Easy as. So that's exactly what they did. The surveillance officers moved in and arrested John Wayne Gacy for the drug charge, whatever. They took him back to the police station. He was in police custody, and later that day, police went to go and speak to him in his holding cell. They told them that they had been given the search warrant and they were about to go and search his house for a second time, and that they knew about his crawl spaces and they would be searching his crawl spaces. They even told him that they expected to find the dead body of 15-year-old Robert Priest under his house. So they were preparing Gacy for what they were about to find. But his response kind of shocked them. He turned to them and he said, "You're not going to find Robert's body under there, but you will find another boy." He said that he had killed a young boy by accident many, many years ago, and it was in self-defense, right? And he panicked because he didn't want to get caught for killing this child, and so he buried the body underneath his garage and then like concreted over it and put the garage over it so that the body could never be found. Police didn't really buy this story, but I mean it didn't really matter anyway because he had confessed to multiple people that he had murdered like 30 people. They had so many different people come into police being like, John Wayne Gacy's just told me he's killed 30 people, do something. The lawyer knew, David Cram, Michael Rossi, Ronald Rhodes, so many people had heard this story from John Wayne Gacy at this point that why would they believe him? Why would they believe that he killed one kid in self-defense years ago? I don't know, whatever. So anyway, they go and they search John Wayne Gacy's house, but it seemed that Gacy had tried to put a couple of obstacles in the way to prevent this search from going ahead. Gacy had unplugged his sump pump, which basically it's a pump that removes water from an area that has no natural drainage, aka the crawl space. It had a sump pump in it so that it wouldn't get flooded with water. Gacy knew that police would likely be trying to search that crawl space at some point, and so he'd unplugged this to make it harder for them to get in there and search. A clever little trick from Gacy. Clever, but not clever enough because all police needed to do was plug it back in and then it'd drain all the water again. Literally, it put them out for about 2-3 hours. They plugged it back in, waited a couple of hours for it to drain the water again, and then they were good to go. They could go in the crawl space and they could search. In the meantime, so they'd plugged this pump back in, yeah, it's draining. In the meantime, they searched the rest of the house. They were looking for any other evidence that could connect Gacy to any of the victims or any evidence that murders had taken place inside that house. But they didn't find, like, anything. They couldn't find anything. They'd already found a lot in the first search, to be honest. They'd found, like, you know, the ring and different items of clothing that didn't belong to Gacy. They pretty much found everything that they were going to find in the actual house itself, but they didn't lose hope because they knew that they were about to find something under that house. They didn't know what, but they knew that there was going to be something there. So a few hours later, once the crawl space was fully drained, they sent in evidence technician Daniel Gentry. He was the first person to go in there, just him, all by himself. He went in and the first thing he did was measure the crawl space. It measured 9 by 11 meters. And this 9 by 11 meter space that he was in seemed empty. Like it was literally just like a mud room. Like it was an empty room. So Daniel took a shovel in there and he went to the furthest corner of the crawl space that he possibly could, and he started digging. Within just a couple of minutes of digging in that crawl space, Daniel uncovered a petrified human arm with a bone sticking out of it, and it was quite a small arm as well, suggesting that it could be a child's. Daniel shouted to the rest of the team who was still upstairs outside of the crawl space, and he told them immediately to go and arrest John Wayne Gacy. He said, "I think this place is full of kids." The next person to enter the crawl space along with Daniel was a police photographer. Of course, he was there to take pictures, but also to help out with the digging. So Daniel was in one corner and the photographer started digging in the opposite corner. And again, within minutes of digging, the photographer hit a bone. It was a small human knee bone, a patella. And what was most worrying about this discovery was that both of these men had found human remains on opposite ends of the crawl space, suggesting that maybe the whole thing was just full of human remains, wall to wall. And these remains that the men found were pretty much just bones. Like the bodies had completely decomposed. And decomposition to this level can sometimes take years. So how long had these bodies been there? How long had John Wayne Gacy been murdering for? Quickly following the last two discoveries, the searchers found a skull, a human skull, and then just underneath that, another human skull buried just a couple of feet below, which also suggested that not only was the crawl space full wall to wall with bodies, but they were also stacked on top of each other as well. Police knew that separating the victims' remains from each other was going to be one hell of a task because, like I said, they were pretty much all fully decomposed, just bones, and they were all buried so close to one another that the bones were kind of intertwined. It was hard to tell what bones belonged to what body. It was genuinely like something out of a horror film. All of these police officers on this case had never experienced anything like it in their careers. It was just kids' bodies, one on top of another, in this mass grave underneath this man's home, completely decomposed, all their bones intertwined. It was awful. So as these searchers continued at the house and as they kept digging and discovering more bones, back at the police station, they decided to let Gacy know what they'd found. They pulled him into an interview room and they basically said, "They're still digging at your house right now, but already so far we have found bones from multiple different bodies. You are looking at multiple murder charges." But Gacy's response once again shocked them. He was always doing these quite like unexpected little moments. He just turned to them and he said, "I knew this was coming." And he said that he was ready to clear the air. He actually seemed really unbothered by this whole thing, by police telling him this. Like, the jig was up, but he didn't really care. In fact, it was almost as if it was a bit of a relief to him because well, I don't know, this had been weighing on him for a very long time. He did seem very, very stressed. Probably more so with the police surveillance, but still. I think he was just glad that he didn't really have to keep this secret anymore. So in the early hours of December 22nd, 1978, John Wayne Gacy sat in an interview room and gave police a full confession of every single one of his murders, all the details that he could remember anyway, from start to finish. Over the last 6 years, Gacy claimed to have killed upwards of 30 different people from so many different places, including Chicago, Lombard, Uptown, Lakeview, Bensonville, the near North Side. I think those are all places in Illinois. He also claimed to have abducted boys from Kalamazoo in Michigan and Hammond in Indiana. I don't know when he was in those specific places, but while he was giving his confession to the police, and I'm gonna talk you through the whole confession, but as he was doing it, he couldn't remember barely any of the names of his victims, although in the aftermath, police did manage to piece most of it together using different identification methods. So I am going to include all the names that I can, even where Gacy didn't in his confession. So just keep that in mind, that he actually couldn't name most of these murder victims that we're about to talk about. And sadly, even still today, in 2022, there are 5 of John Wayne Gacy's victims that are still not identified. They've never been identified. So let's go right back to the start, shall we? To John Wayne Gacy's first ever murder that he committed almost 7 years before he sat and made this confession. It took place on January 3rd, 1972. At the time, he had just gotten married to his second wife, Carol, and Carol and her 2 daughters had moved into his farmhouse. Everything was going well. But on January 2nd, Gacy had been out at a family party, I believe, but without Carol and her kids. I don't know where Carol and the kids were, but Gacy was at this party alone, and then that night he was driving home alone. Well, actually, it was more the early hours of the morning. Gacy was driving through Chicago when he passed the bus station, and he saw a young boy sitting outside the closed bus station all alone in the cold. It was January. It was freezing. Chicago gets so cold in January. This young boy that was sat outside the bus station was 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy. Although, as Gacy was telling this story, he couldn't remember the boy's name or the boy's age. He simply referred to him as the Greyhound bus boy. Timothy had been in Michigan over Christmas, and now that Christmas was over, he was on his way back home to Nevada. But his bus wasn't until the next morning, and the bus station wasn't open overnight, and so he just had to wait outside in the freezing cold until the next morning when he could catch his bus. And when I say cold, I mean cold. Like, Chicago gets into minus temperatures in the winter. It was dangerous for Timothy to be sat outside in the cold for so long. But Timothy had no other choice. He had nowhere else to go. And Gacy told the police that seeing Timothy sitting outside that bus station, it really tugged on his heartstrings. What heartstrings? But anyway, really tugged on his heartstrings. I think we all know the real reason Gacy was interested in this boy. It wasn't because he wanted to help him, was it? But Gacy pulled over his car and went to go and speak with Timothy for a little while. He found out that Timothy was waiting for his bus and it wasn't going to be there until morning. And so Gacy offered a solution to get him out of the cold until his bus arrived. He said that he would take him on a driving tour of Chicago, show him around the city. He could sit in this nice warm car, they could kill a few hours until he could then bring him back to the bus station so that he could catch his bus in the morning. And Timothy was hardly in a position to turn down this offer. Like I said, it was dangerous for him to be outside in such cold temperatures, and so he agreed. He jumped in this stranger's car and just drove around with him for hours. So Gacy took him to all the touristy spots. I don't know what's in Chicago. I don't know. They drove around for ages. They ticked off all the touristy things. The 2 of them were chatting. They were getting to know each other. And once they'd kind of seen everything, what else is there to do? What do they do now? Gacy didn't want to just take him back to the bus station. He didn't want to leave this boy. He'd really taken a liking to him as they'd been chatting for hours. And so he turned to Timothy and he offered him a place to stay for the night. He said he would take him back home. He had a spare bedroom that he could stay in. And then in the morning, he could drop him back off at the bus station in time for him to catch the bus. So Timothy was over the moon with this. And by now, he felt that he could trust this man because they'd been talking for hours and he hadn't done anything weird yet. So Timothy accepted. He went back to Gacy's house and he stayed in the spare bedroom. So Gacy told the police that he took Timothy back home, set him up in the spare bedroom, and then he himself, Gacy, went to sleep in his normal bed with his wife as usual. The next morning, Gacy says he woke up to see Timothy standing in his doorway looking really angry and holding a huge kitchen knife in his hand. Gacy was immediately struck with fear. This fight or flight kicked in and he jumped straight out of bed and went to try and knock the knife out of Timothy's hand. But in doing so, he actually slashed his arm. And actually Gacy still had this scar on his arm. He showed the police this scar on his arm that backed up the story. So now Gacy says that he has just been slashed by this kid holding a knife, and so now he has to go into self-defense mode. He starts fighting for his life, thinking that if he doesn't, Timothy's gonna kill him with this knife. And so Gacy starts punching him, kicking him, pushing him, trying to get him on the floor, whatever. Gacy said that he managed to push Timothy into a wardrobe and close the door, but then Timothy managed to kick open the wardrobe. This sounds like a scene out of a film. And now Gacy flies into a fit of rage. He said he shouted at Timothy, saying, "Motherfucker, I'll kill you," before wrestling him to the ground, grabbing the knife and stabbing him. Frenzied stabbing this 16-year-old boy. He just kept going and going and going. All this adrenaline flowing through his body until eventually he calmed down, he got off of Timothy, and he'd killed him. He had killed this boy. Well, actually, he was almost dead. Gacy said that he then laid down next to Timothy's body and just listened to the gurgulations, he called them, which was Timothy trying to breathe but gargling on his own blood. So up until this point, Gacy said that it had all been quite self-defense-y. He said he flew off the handle towards the end, but that's because Timothy was fighting him. He said that the way that this altercation started, Timothy was the one angry, holding the knife, and Gacy was the one acting in self-defense, right? Based on the story that he just told, he doesn't seem like a cold-blooded killer, does he? That was until one comment that he made towards the end of the story. Gacy said that as he was laying there listening to the gurgulations, he said he really enjoyed listening to Timothy dying, listening to him gasping for breath. So much so that Gacy then described how he climbed up on top of Timothy and had a mind-numbing orgasm. He ejaculated over Timothy's body as he laid dying, and then he said, "That's when I realised that death was the ultimate thrill." Once he was done, Gacy then grabbed the knife, took it to the bathroom, washed the blood off of it, and then took it back to the kitchen where he was going to put it back in the drawer. But as he walked into the kitchen, his heart dropped when he realised the real situation that had just happened. In the kitchen, laid out on the side, were loads of different components to be able to make breakfast. There were 2 plates, 2 sets of cutlery, a carton of eggs, there was an uncut ham joint, whatever. And that was when Gacy realised that Timothy hadn't been trying to kill anyone. When he was holding that knife, it was because he'd come to Gacy's bedroom in the middle of making him breakfast, probably as a thank you for letting him stay over. But Gacy had taken it the wrong way, thought that Timothy was about to kill him, and instead murdered him in self-defense. But it didn't matter what the situation was, Gacy was now a murderer. And he had a dead body laying on his bedroom floor, a dead body that he knew he needed to get rid of, otherwise he'd be in big trouble. So he spent the rest of the day burying Timothy's body on his land. He then poured concrete over the top of it so that no one would ever be able to get to that body. And like I said, that concrete is what became the foundations of the garage that he would later build and would actually later use as a place to murder more boys. So after this first murder, you'd expect him to keep going, wouldn't you? Especially with the way that he talked about it, especially with the aftermath of the murder, realizing that death was the ultimate thrill. It seemed like he really enjoyed himself. But actually, John Wayne Gacy had a 2-year cooling off period. He murdered this boy and then he was too scared to do it again for a while. His second murder victim came 2 years later in January of 1974. However, this second victim is one of those that is unfortunately still unidentified today, so we don't have a name. Gacy told the police that he strangled this second boy with a rope and then stored the dead body, this boy's corpse, in his wardrobe right next to the bed that he slept in with his wife. It was there for days, and his wife had no idea. Gacy said that he just didn't really know what to do with the body. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know where to put it. He didn't know what he was going to do. So he was just storing it in the wardrobe for the time being until he decided something. But the decomposition process began very quickly, as expected, and within a few days, a foul smell was filling their bedroom, although his wife didn't actually seem to notice, or she didn't seem too bothered by it anyway. But then Gacy realised that the body was leaking fluids out of his nose and his mouth. And actually it was like leaking out onto the carpet, staining the carpet. It was causing a horrid smell. Gacy knew that he needed to do something about this. And this was when he started getting David Cram to dig out the crawl space underneath their house. He dug it all out and eventually Gacy moved the body from the wardrobe into the crawl space. This was the first body in that crawl space. And he actually made a comment to police as he was giving this whole confession. He told police that he'd learnt his lesson from this second murder. He knew what he needed to do differently next time, you know, because the bodily fluids leaking out of this guy. He said that from this point on, with most of his future victims, if he knew that he was going to have to store the body for a few days before he could bury it, he would always stuff their mouth or like their orifices with rags or with underwear or with cloth or anything to stop the leaking. His third murder would come about a year and a half later, and the momentum of Gacy's murders is so interesting to me. His first few are like years apart from each other. He seems like too scared to do it again after the first few. But then after a while, there's only like a week between some of his later victims. He was like on a roll towards the end. It's like towards the end, he got addicted to killing. He couldn't go more than a week without doing it. He had like this urge to do it. Sometimes there were only days between his later victims. So yeah, the third of his victims was actually one of Gacy's own employees. He was an 18-year-old boy named John Butkovich. On July 30th, 1975, Gacy was 2 weeks late paying John. And so John approached him to bring this up very politely, very calmly. And so Gacy invited John into his car and they could talk about the money situation as he drove him home. So John jumped in the car, and the two of them drove to Gacy's house. When they arrived, Gacy invited John in for a drink or two, which he accepted. He came inside and the two of them ended up getting absolutely wasted. Like, they had way more than 2 drinks. And once Gacy was sure that John was super drunk, he told him about this magic trick that he knew. He knew how to get out of a pair of handcuffs by magic, you know, without using a key. So he demonstrated this to John. He put the handcuffs on behind his back, he wriggled around for a little while, and then all of a sudden, he's out. It's magic. He tells John that he can teach him how to do this, and John's like, hell yeah, I want to know how to get out of handcuffs as if by magic. So Gacy goes and puts the handcuffs on John behind his back, so now he's all cuffed up. And then Gacy reveals that there was no magic trick. In fact, the magic trick was him using the key to get out of the handcuffs. He had the key in his pocket, he'd undone them behind his back, and now there was no way for John to get out of those handcuffs that Gacy had just put him in. It was all just a trick to get John Butkovich into those handcuffs so that he wouldn't be able to defend himself from what Gacy was about to do. Gacy pushed John Butkovich onto the floor and sat on his chest for a while. I actually think that Gacy thought that this could kill him, because Gacy was quite a big, heavy guy. And so I think he thought that just sitting on this guy's chest for a while might suffocate him, but it wasn't. It wasn't working. Or even if it might have worked, it was going to take too long. Gacy was getting impatient. So whilst still sitting on John's chest, Gacy then took his hands, pressed them against John's neck, and strangled him to death. Once he finished the job, Gacy then dragged John's body to the garage. Well, almost to the garage, but then he was interrupted. His wife, Carol, and her 2 daughters had been out that evening, hence why he was able to have John round at the house and do all this without his wife knowing. But they had just arrived home, just as Gacy was dragging the body to the garage. And suddenly he just started panicking. He knew that he couldn't let Carol or her daughters see this corpse that he was dragging around the garden. He needed to hide it quick. And so he literally just shoved it in this hole that had been dug underneath the garage. This wasn't supposed to be a permanent place for the body, just for the time being place, just to get it out of sight, and he would deal with it properly later. I think the hole was actually supposed to be for like drainage purposes or something, but right now it was the perfect makeshift grave for his 3rd victim. After John Butkovich disappeared, of course he never returned home from work that night, and his parents were really worried. So they reported him missing to the police, and of course John Wayne Gacy was one of the first people to be interviewed because John was at work that day, so maybe his boss knew where he was. No one actually suspected foul play at this point in time. Not police, not his parents. You know, people thought that John Butkovich had just run away, and so they thought that Gacy might know something. Maybe John had been talking about where he was going to run away to or something like that. Gacy just told police that he didn't really know anything. He didn't know John very well. He didn't deal with him very often. He was quite a low-down employee, and obviously John was right at the top, so they didn't communicate all that much. But then a few days later, John Butkovich's car was found abandoned, with his keys and his wallet still inside. So now his parents are thinking, well, he can't have run away. Why would he leave all of his stuff if he's run away? Something bad must have happened to John, because he can't be alive somewhere and living somewhere without money or without his things. His parents started to think that John must be dead, but who could have done it to him? And that was when they remembered a conversation that they had had with their son's boss, John Wayne Gacy, the day after John went missing. They'd asked him if he'd seen John on the day that he disappeared, and Gacy actually said yes. He admitted that he had been the last person to see John on the day that he left work for the very last time. And in fact, he'd been very honest about the conversation that they'd had, that he was late on his payments and that John had to confront him about it. They had a friendly, polite, calm conversation. Gacy agreed to pay him. Gacy assured John's parents that the conversation ended well. He promised to pay him. There was no bad energy, no lingering negativity there. But his parents just didn't believe it. They didn't believe Gacy. They were suspicious of him. They were suspicious of their son's boss, and they made it no secret. They asked police time and time again to look into this man because they knew something was going on. They just knew it. Police did speak to Gacy a few times in relation to the disappearance, but overall, police didn't believe it. They believed in the runaway theory. They believed that John was out there, he wanted to run away, he didn't want to be found, and so eventually they just kind of dropped it. And it was after this 3rd murder that Gacy decided that he no longer wanted to have sex with his wife, Carol. That was when he kind of realised that he just wasn't interested in women. He was only interested in teenage boys. And so he ended the sexual part of the relationship with his wife. And this is important because Gacy said that once he stopped having sex with his wife, it was now in 1975 that he started having sex with young teenage boys exclusively. Gacy referred to this as cruising, where he would go out in his car, he would drive around Chicago looking for young teenage men, usually prostitutes, and he would pick them up and bring them back to his garage for sex. And if you remember, that's what led to his divorce from his wife, Carol, was her catching him going into this garage time and time again with different young boys. But once their divorce was finalized, once Carol was out of the house, her and her daughters were out of the house, and Gacy had the whole thing to himself, this only accelerated his crimes. Now that he had way more privacy and he didn't have anyone to catch him, he could take advantage of so many more boys. So as I'm sure you can imagine, the speed at which his murders happened accelerated horrendously at this point in time. Up until now, his murders had been at least a year apart from each other, sometimes 2 years, sometimes a year and a half. But now the next 30 out of 33 murders took place over the next 2 years. He did 30 in the space of 2 years, from 1976 to 1978. It's hard to believe that over 2 years, someone can murder 30 plus young men, and no one notices. No one even suspects anything. But actually it turns out that the neighbours did see and hear some suspicious stuff, but they never really thought of it as suspicious at the time. They never really put two and two together. Because to be honest, there was no two and two to put together. Let's remember how respected John Wayne Gacy was in that community. Everyone loved him. So when these weird little things would happen, tiny little suspicious things, people would talk themselves out of it, thinking like, oh no, John Wayne Gacy would never be up to anything weird. He's an angel. But yeah, neighbours did notice that once Carol left, John Wayne Gacy's behaviour changed quite a lot. He suddenly became quite like stressed and erratic. He was seen leaving the house late at night. He was seen returning in the early hours of the morning. He suddenly seemed to have no routine, no like schedule. He was just doing weird things, weird times. And this was quite out of character for Gacy because he was quite a hard worker up until like he started like murdering a lot. But yeah, he used to work like 15-hour days, didn't he? He was a grafter. He had a solid routine. But it seemed at this point all of that went out of the window and he just started acting completely different. Neighbours said that they would see the lights turning on and off in Gacy's house at like weird times of night, middle of the night, like the living room light would be on at like 2 a.m. But again, they didn't really think much of it because it seemed that he had a really weird like schedule these days. And actually a lot of the neighbours did see him returning to the house with young boys at weird times of night. But again, they dismissed it in their head. They just kind of thought that it was probably his young employees or whatever. I don't know. They came up with a lot of excuses for Gacy, just on his behalf, just because he was a good guy. But here's the kicker, right? And this is the one that I can't believe was never reported. Some neighbours reported hearing muffled screams coming from John Wayne Gacy's house in the middle of the night. And sometimes they would be so loud that they would wake the neighbours and their children in the middle of the night, yet no one reported anything. Why? And this happened on a few occasions. This wasn't a one-off thing. Like, this happened multiple times. They would be awoken to screams coming from John Wayne Gacy's house, which is so hard to believe that they didn't report anything. I don't know why they didn't report anything. I feel like if this had been in 2022, that would have been reported, hopefully. If you ever hear anything like that, please report it, Jesus. So anyway, Gacy's fourth murder took place about a month after his divorce was finalised. And he went out that night specifically looking for a young man to lure in, to rape, and to murder. He went out looking specifically for his next victim. He drove around for a while until he saw 18-year-old Daryl Sampson on the side of the road. He pulled over, got talking to Daryl, don't know what the conversation was about, but somehow he managed to get Daryl voluntarily to get into his car and come home with him. But Gacy did the exact same thing to Daryl as he had to his previous victims. He murdered him, and actually this time he stuffed a rag down his throat to avoid any leakages. He had learnt from his previous mistakes. He buried the body underneath his house in the crawl space, and exactly a month later he was out looking for his next victim. It was May 14th, 1976 when 15-year-old Randall Reffett went missing on his way home from school. He was walking home from school and just never made it home. Then just a few hours later, another young boy went missing from that same area. This time it was 14-year-old Sam Stapleton. And Gacy claimed responsibility for both of these abductions. He said that he abducted them both separately, picked them up off the side of the road, and drove them back to his house where he raped and murdered them. He saved both of the bodies and then ended up burying them together next to each other in the crawl space. So already his murders are picking up at an alarming rate, 2 in one day. Just 3 weeks later, on June 3rd, Gacy claimed his 7th murder victim. This time it was 17-year-old Michael Bonin. Michael was strangled to death with a ligature, and then Gacy actually buried him under the floorboards of his spare bedroom. Not sure why he didn't put this one in the crawl space, but the spare bedroom is where he would let his lodgers sleep, and sometimes his victims would sleep in there for a few hours before he would murder them. So little did David Cram know, Michael Rossi know, that they were sleeping on top of a dead body under the floorboards. And the murders picked up once again. He was about to claim 4 more victims in the next 6 weeks. His 8th victim was 16-year-old William Carroll. We don't know too much about this one other than he was strangled and buried in the crawl space. His 9th victim was 16-year-old James Harkinson, and the last time James was heard from was actually a mysterious phone call that he made to his parents, although I don't think he said anything in this phone call and then the line cut out, and it's believed that he made this phone call from Gacy's house. Maybe he was trying to get help. And the very next day after that last murder, Gacy struck again. His 10th killing was on August 6th, 1976. This time it was a 17-year-old boy named Rick Johnston, and again we don't know much about the details of this one, although he was killed and buried in the exact same way as the majority of Gacy's victims. His next 3 victims, so 11, 12 and 13, unfortunately have never been identified, although they were murdered between August and October of 1976. One of these unidentified bodies is actually believed to be Gacy's oldest victim. Of course, because by the time the body was found, it was practically just a skeleton. They don't know exactly how old this man was, but his age has been estimated between 23 and 30 years old. But knowing John Wayne Gacy, I think it's safe to say his age was probably on the lower end of that scale. Victims 14 and 15 were actually 2 friends that John Wayne Gacy abducted and murdered at the same time. These were 16-year-old Kenneth Parker and 14-year-old Michael Marino. 2 days after that, Gacy then murdered another one of his own employees. This time it was 19-year-old William Bundy. He went missing after telling his parents that he was going to a party that night. And I don't know if this was a cover story or if Gacy had actually promised him a party. Who knows? Maybe he said that he was having a party at his house. But either way, it ended the exact same as most of his other murders did. He lured William back to his house, strangled him, and then buried his body in the crawl space. At some point during November or December, Gacy couldn't remember exactly when this one was, he abducted his 17th victim. This time it was 21-year-old Francis Alexander. In December of 1976, Gacy got a call one day informing him that one of his employees hadn't shown up at work, 17-year-old Gregory Godzik. But Gacy wasn't worried, because he knew exactly where Gregory Godzik was. Just a few weeks prior, Gregory had been round at John Wayne Gacy's house, helping to dig out some trenches underneath his house, supposedly for some tiling. That was one of Gregory's first jobs that he ever had with the contracting company. Little did Gregory know that he had just dug his own grave, and just a couple of weeks later, he would be strangled and buried in that crawl space by his own boss, making him the serial killer clown's 18th victim now. But this one was a very close call for John Wayne Gacy, because when Gregory Godzik went missing, he told his parents exactly where he was going that night. He was going to his boss's house to go and help out with a job. So of course, when Gregory didn't return home that night, his parents got worried, they called his boss, and this is where things start to get a little bit weird. Gacy told the Godzik family that Gregory had been very, very unhappy for a very long time. In fact, he'd been crying at work, he'd been so distressed and so unhappy with his life that he had decided to run away from home completely. And this came as a total shock to the Godzik family, because he wasn't sad. Well, as far as they were aware, Gregory was so fine. He was happy. He had a great life. They had no inkling that he could be sad at all. That being said, Gacy did seem quite genuine in the conversation that he had with the Godzik family, and so in the end, they just kind of believed him. Maybe Gregory could confide in his boss in a way that he never could with his family, and maybe that's why Gacy knew so much about his emotional state when his family didn't. Who knows, maybe he was just close with his boss. Gacy even told the Godzik family that at some point, since he'd run away, since he'd been missing, that he'd actually received a voicemail from him, and Gregory had said that he was doing all right and, you know, whatever. And so the family were like, oh my god, please let us listen to this voicemail. And then Gacy went to go and get it, and he was like, oh, looks like I've deleted it by accident. Oh, I'm sorry. Convenient. In the end, his family just believed Gacy. They just believed that Gregory had run away, and they just hoped that wherever he was living a happier life. Little did they know that Gacy had murdered their son and buried him underneath his house. Going into the new year, 1977, Gacy claimed his 19th victim on January 20th. This time it was 20-year-old John Schick. And I don't know how Gacy and John Schick met, and I don't know how this came up in conversation, but basically at some point, Gacy offered to buy John's car off him. And so John drove the car to Gacy's house. Gacy had a look in the car. He was like, yeah, looks good. I'll take it. And so he invited John into his house for a celebratory drink while they signed all the paperwork to hand over the car. But once Gacy got John inside his house, he switched on him and he grabbed him by the throat and strangled him to death. This whole time, by the way, as John is being murdered in the hallway, Michael Rossi is in the spare bedroom because this was when he was living with Gacy. He had no idea that his boss was murdering another man in the hallway. The next morning, Michael Rossi woke up and Gacy was like, look, I've got this new car, look at my new car. And if you remember, Michael asked him where he got it and Gacy just couldn't give him a straight answer. He just kind of avoided the question. Turns out it was his murder victim's car. In the end, Gacy actually ended up selling the car to Michael Rossi, who was driving around in it for like a year. He had no idea where it came from, no idea that it was a murder victim's car. The only reason he actually stopped driving it after a year was because he got caught stealing petrol from a gas station or something. And so he had the car seized by the police. And once it was seized, they ran the license plate on the system and they found that it belonged to a missing man, John Schick. Luckily for Gacy, police didn't really look into it. Michael Rossi said that he'd just been given the car as a gift and he had no idea that it belonged to a missing man. And police just kind of dropped it. Although it would have been useful for them to look into that, wouldn't it? Gacy got a lucky escape again, but I just want to take you back to the first search that police did of John Wayne Gacy's home. Do you remember they found that high school ring from 1975 and it had those initials JAS engraved in it? That was John Schick's ring that police found. So after this murder, Gacy's confidence was a little bit knocked. This didn't happen often to him, but it was. He had nearly been caught twice in a row now, and so he decided to lay low for a couple of months. But then by March 15th, 1977, Gacy was ready to get back to business and claim his 20th murder victim. This time, it was a 20-year-old man named John Prestige. That night, John had gone out to a restaurant with some friends and seemed to have gone missing on the walk home. He never made it home that night. His disappearance remained unsolved for so many years. Police had no leads in this disappearance case. Well, not until years later when John Wayne Gacy sat there and confessed to abducting, murdering, and burying this man under his house. Had Gacy never confessed to all these murders, I don't know if they would ever have known what happened to John Prestige. To be fair, I think that's the case with quite a few of these. At this point, by the way, this was the 20th body in the crawl space. Just short of 20 bodies in the crawl space, because a couple of them were put in different places. But you can imagine how full this crawl space is getting by now. There were bodies on top of bodies in there. Gacy's 21st victim is, again, still unidentified to this day. All we know about this victim is that he was between the ages of 17 and 21. And those cases make me so sad, man. Like, that was a young boy with hobbies and interests, likes, dislikes, hopes, dreams, passions. He had a family, he had things that he loved doing, and now we don't even know his name. All we know is that he was between the ages of 17 and 21 when he was brutally murdered. The 22nd victim of the killer clown was 19-year-old Matthew Bowman, followed quickly by 18-year-old Robert Gilroy. As you can see, John Wayne Gacy is building his confidence back up quite quickly now. He told police during his confession that it kind of became like an addiction. Like, he had to do it. He had this overwhelming urge. He would just be like driving in his car at night. He would see a young man on the side of the road and he just had to pull over and get him. It was like an insatiable urge inside him. He admitted that he would make sexual advances on all of the men, well, all of the young boys that he would pick up. Some of them would consent and reciprocate those sexual favors, and some of them would turn him down. And in that case, if they would turn him down, Gacy would just forcefully rape them anyway. He would handcuff them or tie them up so that they couldn't escape him. In some cases, he would even gag them or shove something down their throat to stop them from screaming. We're nowhere near the end, by the way. We've still got a lot to go. His 24th victim was 19-year-old John Mowery. Again, he picked him up, drove him home, raped him, strangled him, and buried him in the crawl space. From October to December of 1977, Gacy was on a roll. Once again, he killed about 5 more victims in the space of 6 weeks. These 5 victims over the space of 6 weeks were 21-year-old Russell Nelson, 16-year-old Robert Winch, 19-year-old David Talsmer, and 20-year-old Tommy Bowling, who actually had a baby at home, which is so sad. And you might have noticed that I only said 4 names when I said he had 5 victims in 6 weeks, and that's because the 5th of those victims was actually one of John Wayne Gacy's only survivors. And Gacy seemed to look back on this one particular assault very fondly. He remembered a lot more details about this one than he did all the other ones. It seemed as though this was one of his favourites. This victim was 19-year-old Robert Donnelly. Gacy had been just driving around one night when he noticed Robert walking down the street. He pulled over his car and abducted Robert at gunpoint. He drove him back to the house where he tortured and raped him for hours and hours. And one of these torture methods was repeatedly dunking his head into freezing cold water in the bath so that he was like nearly passing out. In fact, he actually did pass out at one point because Gacy had to pull him out of the bath, wait for him to wake up, and when he did, he taunted this boy saying, "Aw, aren't we playing fun games tonight?" Robert had been pleading throughout this whole ordeal for Gacy to just let him go, to just spare him, to just let him live. And of course, Gacy was loving every second of this. He loved experiencing the fear in his victims. Then after hours and hours and hours of being raped and tortured, Robert realised that the chances of him being let go alive were very, very unlikely. He really thought that John Wayne Gacy was going to murder him. His plea changed from "please let me go" to "please just kill me. Please just get it over with." And actually, this had the adverse effect on John Wayne Gacy. He took pity on Robert and actually decided to let him go. Gacy told Robert to jump in his car. He drove him to where he worked and then told him to get out. And before Gacy sped away, he told him not to tell the police. That was the only victim that Gacy ever, intentionally took pity on and spared and, let them live. I wonder what was so different about this one compared to the others. In the following days, Robert was so traumatized by what he'd been through, and he was so terrified that John Wayne Gacy was going to come back for him that he didn't tell anyone anything about what had happened to him. But after about a week of living with all of this just circling through his head, he couldn't take it anymore, and he eventually went to the police. Police immediately brought John Wayne Gacy in for questioning. I'm not sure how they knew exactly who to bring in, but they brought him in. But Gacy had already thought this through. He knew that there was a chance that Robert would go to the police, and so he already had a cover story ready. Gacy told the police that he and Robert were lovers. Well, ex-lovers now. He said that the two of them used to be in a relationship, a very, how do I put this? It was kind of like a master and sex slave relationship where Gacy was essentially allowed to abuse Robert in a sexual way, and it was consensual, Gacy told the police that he had recently broken up with Robert, and Robert was very bitter about it. He did not want to break up. But also, he wasn't just bitter about the breakup. Gacy also said that he was bitter because he owed him money. So basically, Gacy's just telling police, look, don't listen to him. He's my jealous ex-boyfriend. He just wants to get back at me. He's just making up these lies to ruin my life. And police believed him. They didn't believe Robert anymore. They believed John Wayne Gacy. They let Gacy go completely free of any charges, and within a month, he was back to killing. His 29th murder was of a 19-year-old boy named William Kindred. His 30th murder was supposed to be of a 26-year-old man named Jeffrey Rignall, but this one didn't quite go to plan. With Jeffrey, he had found him on the side of the road, pulled over, abducted him, and once he got him inside the car, he chloroformed him to knock him out. He took Jeffrey back to his house where he absolutely tortured this man. He raped him time and time again. He was whipping him, pouring hot wax on him. He was doing all sorts to this man. He was tied up the whole time as well. I can't remember if I said that. He was tied up. And whenever Jeffrey tried to fight back, Gacy would just grab the chloroform and knock him out again while he raped him. He actually did this a few times throughout the hours of torture that Jeffrey had to sustain. And it was around this time when he was torturing Jeffrey that Gacy realised he couldn't actually kill him because the crawl space was full. He had managed to fill up the crawl space with bodies now. So even if he was to kill Jeffrey, where was he going to put the body? There was physically no space left for another body. And so with that, the killer clown had to let another one of his victims go alive. Gacy drove him out to some random park in Chicago and chloroformed him one last time and then left Jeffrey's unconscious body on the floor. Just left him to wake up. When Jeffrey did wake up, he managed to walk to his girlfriend's house. He told her everything, and then the two of them went to the police station together to report the incident. However, police did pretty much nothing to investigate this one, which makes me so mad. I don't know why. This man had been tortured, raped for hours, and police didn't really seem to care, actually. And this only pumped up John Wayne Gacy's confidence so much more, because at this point, he'd let two victims go alive and not seen any consequences. As far as he was aware, police weren't onto him. Like, he was invincible in his eyes at this point in time. He thought that he could do anything and get away with anything. His actual 30th murder victim was a 20-year-old boy named Timothy O'Rourke. However, once he killed Timothy, he had the same problem as last time. The crawl space was still full. Where was he going to put this body? So he had to think fast about where he was going to get rid of this body. And then he remembered the Des Plaines River that was like not too far away from where he lived. He hoped that if he threw the body in this river, it would just like get washed away. It might sink, it might disintegrate, who knows. And worst comes to worst, if it did wash up on the shore, then it might just look like a drowning victim. I don't know. Anyway, he disposed of the body in the Des Plaines River. Gacy was a little bit anxious after this one though, because he knew that there was the possibility that the body could wash up and then it could cause issues for him. So for weeks afterwards, months even, Gacy was glued to the news, waiting for a report to come up about a body being found in the river. He needed to know what was going on with this investigation. But every single day he would tune into the news and nothing was coming up. It didn't seem as though they'd found this body at all. So maybe the Des Plaines River was the perfect place to dispose of a body if it's not going to wash up. So now John Wayne Gacy's confidence is on its way back up. He realised that he could keep doing these murders and probably keep getting away with them if he kept putting the bodies in the river. He waited nearly 5 months before committing his next murder because he was that anxious. And this one actually took place on November 4th, 1978. This time he abducted and strangled an 18-year-old boy named Frank Landigan. And again, he disposed of the body in the Des Plaines River. But this time it didn't quite go to plan. It didn't go as smoothly as the first one because about a week later, Frank's naked body washed up on the riverbank. Police were called and they of course recovered the body, but they weren't able to identify it, and they actually couldn't figure out how Frank had died either. And so this wasn't categorized as a murder, there wasn't a major investigation, so Gacy still got away with it. Well, that was until he confessed later on, and then police knew that he was responsible. And actually, I mean, you would think this would scare John Wayne Gacy a little bit because he's a little bit anxious at this point in time. But actually, it really didn't put him off, and he was ready to kill again a week later. This time, he abducted 20-year-old James Mazzara, who was walking home from a Thanksgiving dinner. He abducted him, raped him, tortured him, murdered him, and then disposed of his body in the Des Plaines River. river. And then John Wayne Gacy's 33rd and final victim was, of course, 15-year-old Robert Priest on December 11th, 1978. This was the murder that kickstarted this whole investigation, the start of the end for Gacy. Gacy had denied involvement in this disappearance the whole time police had been questioning him, up until now when he was giving this full confession, and he finally confessed that yes, he had abducted Robert Priest, and yes, he had murdered him. But now we have more details on how this went down. So Gacy told the police that he had met up with Robert outside of the pharmacy, told him that he had a job for him, and that was how he managed to lure him back to his house. Robert willingly got in Gacy's car and he drove him back. Once he was there, he did the old handcuff magic trick method thing, you know, where there's no magic trick and he just gets to handcuff his victim. And once he did, he turned to Robert Priest and said, "I'm going to rape you, and you can't do anything about it." Gacy tied a piece of rope around Robert's neck as he cried hysterically. And in that moment, Gacy's phone started ringing. Before he got up to go and answer the phone, Gacy made sure that the rope was tied as tight as he possibly could around Robert's neck so that he couldn't make any noise, so that he couldn't disturb the phone call. It was just a business call for Gacy, nothing too exciting, but Robert had to sit there and listen to this as he was slowly being strangled to death by this rope around his neck. And that is where John Wayne Gacy ended his confession. 33 murders plus more victims on top of that. So police now needed to connect John Wayne Gacy's confession to the physical evidence that they had, you know, all those bodies in the crawl space. So the next thing they did, they asked him to draw out a map of the crawl space and try and map out where as many of the bodies were as he could possibly remember. And the next day, a full archaeological investigation was launched to try and recover as many bones as they possibly could from under this man's house. And this was such a tricky investigation. As I said earlier in the video, imagine how hard this would be. All the bodies were so packed in there, so close together. They were all just skeletons at this point in time. It was so hard for them to be able to tell what bone belonged to what body. And all of these investigators that were down there in the crawl space, they had to be so careful, like where they were moving, where they were standing, because, well, honestly, everywhere they stood, they were standing on a body. They couldn't help it. There was nowhere else to stand. In the end, they had to pretty much dismantle the whole of John Wayne Gacy's house to be able to like get to all of these bodies. They had to rip up all the floorboards. They pretty much just gutted the whole house. They had specialists like sifting through the soil for weeks and weeks and weeks, looking for even the tiniest little fragments of bones, maybe some teeth, anything that could help identify these bodies. And as they started to identify these remains underneath the house, they were starting to learn more and more about each individual murder. Like victim number 5, Randall Raffett, he was one of the first to be found with a cloth still inside his mouth. Like the cloth was still in his skeleton when his remains were found. At first, police thought it was a gag. You know, he'd been gagged as he was being murdered and then it had just been left in there. But after they heard John Wayne Gacy's confession, they realised that he'd probably just stuffed this rag inside Randall's mouth to stop any leakages. Victim number 7, Michael Bonin, was one of the first to be found with a piece of cloth around his neck bones, suggesting that whatever had been used to strangle him had just been left around his neck when his body was buried. Timothy McCoy, Gacy's first ever victim, you know, the one that he stabbed to death and it was all supposedly an accident. When his remains were recovered, they found loads of little notches in his ribs, which, I mean, backs up Gacy's story that he stabbed him multiple times. And just a bit of a side note, I find this one particular murder quite interesting. It was his first ever one, and this was the only bloody murder that Gacy carried out. After this one, he decided he didn't want to use knives for some reason. I don't think he ever explained why he changed his murder method to strangulation after this. I don't know if he didn't like the act of stabbing Timothy that much, or I don't know. I don't know if the blood was too messy. I really wonder why. That one really interests me. You don't see that very often, where they would do like one murder in one way and then change completely for the rest. Gacy's 8th victim, William Carroll, his remains were actually found with a ball of socks in his pelvic region, suggesting that he had had this ball of socks stuffed inside him, inside his anus, around the time of his death. A couple of other bodies were also found with prescription medication bottles around the pelvic region, again suggesting that they had been shoved inside the men, but inside the boys when they were killed. And something else that was discovered during this investigation, as they were pulling out all these bones, it seemed that a couple of John Wayne Gacy's victims had been dismembered, had been chopped up, which is something that he conveniently left out of his whole confession. But they knew that it was true because a lot of the bones seemed to have been cut with a knife. Like, actually dissected. There were a couple of bodies that seemed to have been decapitated, all of their limbs cut off, some of them were just torsos. I mean, this was only a couple of the bodies, but I find it really interesting that he didn't even so much as hint about that in his confession. Finally, in March of 1979, after about 3 months of searches, police were finally done with John Wayne Gacy's house, and the whole thing was demolished. The last 4 of John Wayne Gacy's victims were eventually found from the Des Plaines River, one of which had a pair of underwear shoved all the way down their throat. But this actually wasn't their cause of death. So this victim, his name was Frank, and this pair of underwear was shoved so far down his throat that it had actually made him vomit. But of course, the vomit couldn't come out properly, and so Frank actually ended up drowning on his own vomit. One of the last bodies to be recovered from the river was John Wayne Gacy's final victim, 15-year-old Robert Priest. He'd been choked to death by Gacy, and he was also found with wads of paper shoved down his throat. It's believed that Gacy probably did this when the phone started ringing, to stop Robert from making any noise and blowing his cover. So now that all of this evidence had fallen into place, police could finally charge John Wayne Gacy with 33 counts of murder. They asked him one last time if there were any more bodies that they hadn't found or that they were yet to find, and Gacy responded, "That's for you to find out." So now Gacy was due to go to trial. Well, in about a year's time, obviously. The trial needed to be prepared. But in the meantime, he underwent 300 hours, well, over 300 hours of different psychological tests and observations, different assessments. They really wanted to know what the hell was going on in this man's brain to make him do all of this. And Gacy tried absolutely everything in his power to seem insane. He did not want to be found legally sane because that would mean that he would probably get the death penalty for what he had done. Whereas if he could seem like he wasn't mentally well, then he might just get time in prison or in a hospital, maybe. So John Wayne Gacy tried to convince all of his psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. And he said that he had 4 different personalities, 4 different alters. There was the clown, who was jolly, fun, lovable, happy. There was the contractor, who was hardworking, determined. There was the politician, who was serious, mature, intelligent. And then there was Jack Hanley, although sometimes Gacy referred to this one as Bad Jack. And Bad Jack was a nasty piece of work. He was homophobic, he was abusive, he abused prostitutes. He just disrespected any member of society that he deemed less than him. And that was most people. Bad Jack referred to gay men and sex workers as degraded scum. It seemed that he had a particular hatred for young gay sex workers. And Gacy told his psychiatrist that when he did that massive confession with police, he was just confessing to Bad Jack's crimes, and that the clown, the politician, and the contractor had nothing to do with the things that Jack Hanley had done. Wait, does that mean anything? I don't know why I haven't checked that. Can someone let me know if Jack Hanley means anything? I've just Googled it. It's a museum. I don't know. An art gallery. But yeah, psychiatrists just didn't believe that John Wayne Gacy had multiple personality disorder. It just didn't seem genuine. It seemed actually far too convenient. And obviously, psychiatrists know the exact symptoms and behaviours to be looking out for, and he just wasn't displaying genuine symptoms of having this disorder. It honestly seemed like a desperate attempt to be seen as mentally ill in order to get away with his crimes, I guess. There were several different doctors that were brought in and they had several different opinions. None of them thought that he had multiple personality disorder. However, most of them thought that he did have paranoid schizophrenia, and he was diagnosed with that in the end. Doctors thought that these personalities that Gacy claimed to have were actually just voices in his head. It was just his schizophrenia. And because of this diagnosis, Gacy's defense team decided it would be best for him to try and plead not guilty to the murders and say that he just wasn't of sound mind at the time when he committed them. But the prosecution didn't agree with that at all. They thought that Gacy was in full control of his behavior, and they said that it was evident in the way that he went about things. He intentionally tried to cover up and get away with his murders. If he was mentally ill, he wouldn't realize that what he was doing was wrong, really. And he repeated this process over 30 times. So once Gacy's team realized that they wouldn't really be able to get away with the mentally ill excuse, they decided to switch up their story completely, and I can't believe this. They tried to say that the deaths were accidental. They tried to say that most, if not all, of John Wayne Gacy's victims had died from erotic asphyxiation. So they'd all consented to being choked or strangled during sex, and at some point things kind of got out of hand and it ended fatal. Although that was never the intent, supposedly. It was a consensual sexual act that just got out of hand accidentally, and no one was to blame, you know? I'm not sure how on earth you could do that 33 times in a row. 33 times in a row. If that happened once, if you had a sexual partner and you were doing this consensually and they died in the middle of sex by accident, why are you repeating that 32 times? Just to see if it's going to happen again. What? And you just burying the bodies every time. You dug out a whole grave underneath your house to just keep burying your failed sexual partners in. That just don't make sense. Not even a little bit. Not even a tiny bit. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting a bit heated. So during the murder trial, they were calling up a bunch of different witnesses, including Gacy's old lodgers, David Cram and Michael Rossi, his attempted victims that had managed to get away, even some old KFC employees and workers that he'd known. One of his surviving victims took the stand, and he was being quizzed for a long time about this. They were making him go into details of his ordeal, and actually at one point he threw up as he was recounting all these details. It was so clear how traumatized he was. And throughout these victim statements, Gacy was seen laughing and smiling and smirking as if he was enjoying listening to the details of what he'd done to these boys, enjoying hearing how traumatized they were. All in all, the trial lasted a month and a half. And when it started, Gacy was super confident, he was cocky. I really think he thought he was getting away with this. But as time went on, as the trial went on, his confidence dwindled as he saw just how bad he looked in this trial. And by week 5, Gacy actually wrote a really long letter to the judge saying that he wanted a retrial because he didn't like the way that his lawyer had gone about things. He felt like his lawyer had actually acted in a way that was detrimental to his case. In the letter, Gacy said that he didn't agree with the insanity plea. He didn't want to give that plea, and he actually wanted to testify for himself, but his lawyers weren't going to let him. He was saying that his lawyers just wanted to do things their way and he wanted to do things his way. And the judge basically wrote back and said, shut up. He was basically like, look, we're not doing a retrial. If you want to take the stand and testify, you can. No one's stopping you. Your lawyer can't stop you doing that, but we're not going to retrial. And once the judge said that, Gacy shut up completely. He was just like, yeah, no, never mind. I don't want to take the stand anymore. At the end of the trial, the prosecution called John Wayne Gacy the worst of all murderers and said that he had caused more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes. He had killed more people than a lot of earthquakes, than a lot of hurricanes had. Gacy's defense came back to that and said that he was just a man driven by compulsions that he was unable to control. He was mentally ill and therefore not at fault for any of this. His team said that they really didn't think that Gacy would benefit from being behind bars, from just being locked away in a cell. They said that he needed treatment, he needed help, he needed medication and counseling and psychiatrists. He needed hospitalizing, not a prison cell. The prosecution argued that the insanity plea that they were trying to put in was a sham and that it was an insult to actual genuinely mentally ill people. There was evidence that John Wayne Gacy had planned and premeditated his murders. He had acted in a very calm, cool, controlled way throughout the whole thing. So the jury went to deliberate their verdict, and it took them just 2 hours to come back and find John Wayne Gacy guilty of all 33 counts of murder plus a bunch of counts of sexual assault on top of that. The jury was then asked to go back and deliberate again, this time to see if they think John Wayne Gacy should be put up for the death penalty, if he should be executed. And again, it really didn't take them much time at all to come back and say that he should be executed. John Wayne Gacy's death date was then set for June 2nd, 1980. But he actually sat on death row for 14 years. He never ended up dying on that day. He died 14 years later. He was just chilling in prison for 14 years. Basically, I think it's because he tried to appeal the decision so many times that it just kept having to like get pushed back and back and back. I don't know if that was just a tactic for him to like stay alive a bit longer. I don't know, because realistically, was it ever gonna get overturned? No, you're John Wayne Gacy, you're the killer clown. In those 14 years that he was just chilling in prison, just on death row, John Wayne Gacy did a lot of press interviews. A lot. Yeah, for a serial killer, he did a lot of press interviews. And in these interviews, there's quite a few interesting quotes, actually. In one of them, he said that he didn't believe in hitting children. What? A 33-time murderer, torturer, rapist doesn't believe in hitting children. I mean, what? He also collaborated with an author to publish a book, and the title of this book, man. It was called Buried Dreams. And essentially this book was just like a serial killer biography of his life, and he gave some details about some of the murders. I don't know how that book was allowed to be made, and I'll be fuming if he made any money off that. But there was actually an upside to this book being made, because Gacy went into quite a bit more detail in this book than he had in his confession to the police. And this book actually led to 2 more of the unidentified bodies eventually being identified. I will have named them in this video, so I don't know which 2 bodies they were, but at least we know about them now. Also, in his time on death row, John Wayne Gacy actually ended up getting into a fight with another serial killer named Henry Brisbane. They'd always had power struggles between the 2 of them, between Gacy and Brisbane, because they were both the serial killers of the wing. You know, they both wanted to be like top dog, the scariest guy on that prison ward or whatever. They wanted to be king of the serial killers. So they would both always have these fights, these arguments, and then one day Henry Brisbane turns round and he's made a makeshift knife and he stabbed John Wayne Gacy in the arm, I think. Yeah, in the arm, random. So Gacy had to be taken to the prison hospital. He got some stitches. And Gacy's final death date was rescheduled for May 10th, 1994. And his last words ever to his lawyer were, "Taking my life will not compensate for the loss of others. The state is murdering me." The day before his execution, John Wayne Gacy was allowed to have a picnic on prison grounds with his family in order to say goodbye to them. But like I said earlier, what family? I don't know who showed up to that picnic. I really couldn't find much about it because he really didn't have any family in the end, did he? That night, Gacy had his final meal, his death row meal. Do you want to know what he had? Consisted of a bucket of KFC chicken, a dozen deep fried shrimp, a pound of strawberries, and a bottle of Diet Coke. He then went and prayed with a Catholic priest, and then he was sent straight to the execution chamber at like 1 a.m. They didn't even let him sleep and then go there in the morning to be killed. They were just gonna do it now, just get it over with. It was gonna be done by lethal injection, and it was, but everything didn't quite go to plan. So the way that the lethal injection worked in this instance was that Gacy was going to be given 3 different drugs, one after the other after the other. The first one is to sedate the person, which is supposed to try and make it like the most humane way of killing someone. Like they're not going to feel anything, they're just out cold and then they die. They fall asleep forever. The second injection that they get is to paralyze all their muscles. And then the third injection is finally the one that kills them. That is the one that stops the heart and causes them to die. So yeah, like I said, they're given one and then the other and then the other. So they set him all up, everything's going well, they get the IV in his arm and they inject the first one to sedate him. But as they inject it into, like, you know, the tubes and everything, it crystallized in the tube. They couldn't get it into Gacy's body. This was really weird. This had never happened before. So they had to disconnect it all and like get new equipment and remeasure out all the different, you know, things. So yeah, anyway, they disconnected it all, reconnected it all, injected him, and this time it worked. And John Wayne Gacy was executed. The killer clown was pronounced dead just before 1 a.m. on May 10th, 1994. His last words ever were "kiss my ass." After his death, John Wayne Gacy's brain was actually sent off for testing because what the hell went on there? I don't know if they ever really found anything, but it's actually still preserved in formaldehyde to this day. John Wayne Gacy's brain just exists somewhere in like a jar. I find that so crazy. The rest of his body was cremated. And one of the saddest things about this case is that 5 of John Wayne Gacy's 33 victims are still unidentified to this day. They found their remains, but they can't identify them, and none of their families know where they are or what happened to them. But yeah, that is everything for this really, really long case. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching. Thank you for coming back to my channel after my break. I really, really appreciate it, and I'm so excited to be back. I can't wait to make more videos like this. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting me and helping decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the link to do so in the description, or you can click the join button if you're on a desktop. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. That would really help me out. If you want to subscribe, you can click this circle right here, or if you want to watch another video, there'll be one right there. Okay, bye!